Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to note, I think it's a little cold. So maybe we
Are
can,
you cold?
I'm cold. And I've been here for a while, so maybe I got cold and I didn't have I didn't go down to the old city today to see so thank you to the organizer. Okay. Okay, so thank you all. I'm very pleased that the opportunity to be here. Very honored. I apologize that I wasn't able to be at all the activities. Even though we're on strike, we're still very busy. So trying to balance everything and also come to a few of the lectures and activities. So here I am this morning. I want to thank the organizers again for inviting me. Let me introduce myself a little bit. I think it's not, besides getting to know you and you getting to know me, and that perhaps will be useful. I think it's instructive also about how one can try to, an historian of the late medieval Islamic world can try to work with, learn about the Crusades, learn about Mediterranean history, learn about European history, and actually try to do something, at least here and there, that touches upon these matters. Perhaps it's relevant also. So I've tried in my own modest way to look at some of the Frankish aspects of let's call it the history of the Mamluk Sultanate, and a little bit before the Mamluk Sultanate, actual warfare, the Franks in the Levant, at least trying to understand what was going on there, diplomacy, trade, Mediterranean trade, and I want to say two aspects. One is the slave trade, and I'll touch upon that a little bit later, how important the slave trade was, much of it conducted by Franks, or at least facilitated by Franks, perhaps most of it even. Then later the spice trade and the transient trade through Egypt, but not only the transient trade from the Indian Ocean and perhaps further east through Egypt into the Mediterranean, but also things that came in and out of Egypt and Syria itself. What Egypt and Syria had to offer and what Egypt and Syria needed, that's certainly also very much a matter of the Mediterranean, very much a matter of the Franks. What I've tried to do actually is put the history of this region, Egypt and Syria and nearby regions, the central, let's call it today we would call the core of the Arab world, or the core of the Middle East, to put this into a larger perspective. And I again, looking east, looking towards Iran, and I would even say the Eurasian steppe, and on the other hand, also putting it into the Mediterranean context. So I found it interesting. I don't know, and I found it compelling, and I think it makes and here and there, perhaps it improves my work. Or at least I can say that I try to go beyond and look at the wider context. Now, that combines with, and I should mention, maybe this is, I should mention how did that happen? You know, when did that happen? I mean, obviously one can be curious, but I think coming to the Hebrew University, when I did it in the very beginning of the 1980s, and I'd been in Israel for several years, and of course, those of you with a sharp ear can discern a Philadelphia accent. It's a hard burden to bear, I know, for you and for me, but it's the way of the world, and but it has its advantages growing up in Philadelphia. As Paul Cobb said, when I told him I was actually from Philly and I went to Central High, he said, "Oh, you know how to fight." So, the one I don't know about that, but anyway, one knows how to take care of oneself. But anyway, but coming here after being several years in Israel and then coming to the Hebrew University, moving to Jerusalem eventually, and at the Hebrew University in the early 80s. Crusading studies was extremely strong, and I didn't study directly with anybody from that group, but I went to lectures, and of course Professor Prover and others, and Professor Kedar, and I went to the Yad Ben Zvi lectures, and my own teachers, and particularly Professor David Ayalon, and also Moshe Sharon, were certainly aware, and they also saw the bigger picture too. And so one could not help but to realize how important this was for, even if you're studying Middle Eastern and Islamic studies in this period. Perhaps at the end of my talk, I'll talk a little bit why I got into this particular niche. of Middle Eastern and Islamic studies. I have to say that towards the middle of the decade, I met Ronnie Andino, and that was a fortuitous, by chance, but also very fortunate meeting, I think, for me at least. And it certainly influenced ongoing discussions with Ronnie till the very end. Were very instructive for me. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit too, because it's not just the subject matter, it's also methodology. And then I went to the UK. I was in the UK for a year in 85, 86. I was in London, studying at SOAS. I studied with David Morgan. I studied with some of you may know, Sandy Morton was my Persian teacher. And I got to know a lot of people, probably most importantly from in London was Robert Irwin. But I also worked with Peter Jackson, and who was also a teacher of Jonathan. What that means is, first of all these Middle Eastern historians had good grounding in European history too. They'd all done BAs in European history. So that was also part of it. But particularly Peter, who kept both of these things up and other things too. It's the Mongols and it's India, and it was the Middle East, and of course the Mediterranean and Europe, and proficiency in a lot of languages. And that was also very inspiring. And I also went to Riley Smith at his seminar on the Crusades in the Senate House. I'm sure some of you were there too at some point. And again, very instructive and very inspiring, and also very humbling. So again, those things, I think that's important to say, that how interesting, and whatever I do, I realize how little I know about about what goes on beyond the other side of the Mediterranean, sometimes this side of the Mediterranean. But I've tried to keep it up, and I tried to read, and I tried to and I certainly talk to people. And now Iris and I have a project together. It's funded by the ISF, the Israel Science Foundation, and just really getting off now, getting started properly. But I think it's that may take us to interesting places too. So one needs to know what one's good at, and one needs to know what interests, what one finds interesting. But at the same time, one has to know one's limitations, or at least and aspirations and limitations. So I think that Iris and I, found this way that we can help each other and learn from each other, and together the sum is greater than the parts too. So I at least hopefully. Now that's in sort of general in terms of subject matter, the subject matter that interests me over the years. And if I would say in one sentence, what interests me, but of course this is that how the steppe peoples came to the Middle East. Starting early, we can talk about the 9th century, the encounter between the Islamic world and the steppe world, or the peoples of the Islamic world, or the Muslims, if you wish, or the Muslim rulers and soldiers and elites with the peoples coming from the steppes, and the Turks, and more Turks, and of course we all remember that the Turks don't come from Turkey; they have to come to Anatolia and turn it into Turkey. And then of course their cousins, the Mongols, and more Turks, and the whole interaction. So my thesis was on the Mongols and the Mamluks, the war between the Mongols and the part of the war between the Mongols and the Mamluks. But one can't do that, of course, without taking into consideration the Franks. And certainly, I think Frankish history for that period too, Mediterranean history, can't help but deal with with both the Mamluks and the predecessors, the Ayyubids, and of course the Mongols too. Another interesting topic, which I won't delve into at all. But besides the subject matter per se, I have to say that I've been influenced. I don't have any pretensions whatsoever about being a master, but I can say I think I'm informed by both historical geography and archaeology. And Benny talked about that earlier in his talk, about how important it is for us as historians to have some basic understanding of what archaeology can give us and what archaeologists have to say. Of course, it cuts both ways. I think archaeologists can certainly find it useful what we do. And I include with that too historical geography. I mean, the idea of landscape, the idea of topography, and I'm going to tell us a very quick story, and I won't mention any names here, but a colleague of ours, an Israeli colleague of ours, who's an important geographer and also historian of the late Middle East, medieval Middle East, was once sitting together with a group of philologists and historians of the early Islam, and they're all very extremely competent in Arabic and Islamic history and Islamic studies, and they're sitting around trying to decide on the basis of philology where the water from Fort Ramla came from. And they're all talking about it, and they're trying, and our colleague is sitting there listening. He has a background in geography, and he's listening, says, you know what, those Arabs must have been something that they could make water run uphill. Just look at a topographical map, and that'll certainly narrow down, and he found it, and they found it. But the idea that one can talk about history and be divorced from topography, and be divorced from logistics, and be divorced from infrastructure, and let alone what's underneath the landscape, what the archaeologists turn up, I think is that's an old way of doing things, and we certainly should all aspire, each in our own modest way, to take the I guess the real world into account when we look at our historical sources. I've also taken into account, and I've even delved a little bit, ever so modestly, in numismatics, but particularly epigraphy, Arabic epigraphy, and there's so much there for all of us. Now we don't have to sit and it's a lifetime project to become a good numismatist, and I very early on decided that was not going to be my project. That was but I've seen people stick their hand into a bag and pull out one bronze coin and go like, this is Barkuk, virtually, literally like that. So one can get to that point. That's not me. But I read what they write, and that's what's important. And I think we can read a lot. And I think as historians, let alone economic history, that's obvious. But we see what's written on the coins. What are they trying to tell us? And I think that I've learned a lot, and also inscriptions. And inscriptions have been published and they've been translated. And of course, and I think it's come up, Moshe Sharon's ongoing project of the Corpus of Arabic Inscriptions, 7 or 8 volumes have come out, and Jerusalem 2 is about to come out too. This is really important, and let alone his analysis, and let alone everything that's around it, but the texts are there for us to study and to use for us. And of course, that's what Moshe does. Arabic is epigraphy, and I've done a little bit myself, published 3 or 4 articles in the subject myself. And it's not fully used. I don't find historians fully use what's available in epigraphy, what we can learn from it, how it can inspire us in discussion of legitimacy, in a discussion of chronology of how things were done. So anyway, there's room to be done. There's much room to be of work here, and I would say that both these subjects have somewhat informed me, or all these subjects have somewhat informed me, and I do my best, as we all try to do in life in general. We do our best. So anyway, at the end of the day, I'm a historian of the late medieval Islamic world, and growing up. I mean, I have my BA from the University of Pennsylvania, but then when I restarted my studies, and by the way, when I came to Israel, I had no intention whatsoever of continuing my studies. I was going to live on a kibbutz at the end of it, and I did that for 6 years, and I don't regret it, but it was time to move on. But coming to Jerusalem again in the 1980s, and being in the Institute for Asian and African Studies, where it was my home and still my home, and being exposed to the way Islamic studies were done, and to a certain degree still done at the Hebrew University and in Israel in general, I was exposed to a lot of intellectual history, and of course the philological approach, and I'm very happy about that. But my emphasis has changed. I mean, here I see Ayalon's influence, David Ayalon's military history. One could call it the international relations, the IR of the Middle East, questions of religious and linguistic change, which again, by the way, Milka's not here, but everything Milka's done, and also Ronnie, for me is a great starting point, jumping off point for some of my further work under the Mamluks, Palestine under the Mamluks, what the questions of Islamization under the Mamluks, and as I said, the coming of the Turks in the Middle East, and in general, the history of late medieval Palestine. And this ties in with what Iris and I are working on now on the coast after 1291. What happens to the Palestinian coast after 1291, or perhaps a little further north? But that's our general project. Now I want to say something about the Mamluks. As a quarter of a millennium of real rule. And most of the time, the sultans were really in charge. So it's not the Ottoman Empire, 600 years, more than 600 years. But on the other hand, as we all know, for at least part of the Ottoman Empire, the sultans often were not really the rulers. On the other hand, you look at many other dynasties in the Middle East and perhaps elsewhere, and the Seljuks, the great Seljuks, 60 years, maybe. Depends how you want to define it. The Ilkhanids, the Fatimids, less than 200 years. The Ayyubids, not much to say, a show, 70, 80 years. So the Mamluks ruled a large period of time, a quarter of a millennium or more. We have a Turkish speaking, and here I'm going to see what we got here. Of course, I have no idea what I'm doing, not doing right.
But this is
Okay. Oh, okay, so this puts us into a perspective here. Okay, so this map is surely known to everybody here, but it's good to help. And what's important here to see is this is about 1300. Okay, so by this time, the Franks in the Levant are just a memory, a recent memory, but just a memory. The Mamluk Sultanate isn't very clear. The gray spots there are very weak. But I think up to the Euphrates and up to touching upon what's today more or less the border between Turkey and Syria today, such as it is. But of course, we see a very large Mongol Ilkhanate, including most of Anatolia and controlling also Lesser Armenia or Armenia and Cilicia, if you wish. To the north, we have the Golden Horde, which another Mongol state, which is particularly important. One, because it is where the young Mamluks come from. They come from via Krim. Modern history, contemporary events are exactly the area of which sort of the background in many ways to the rise and continuation of the Mamluk Sultanate. So Crimea is is where the Mamluks, most of the young Mamluks came from, were shipped through, let's call it that. And of course, the Golden Horde became an ally of the Mamluks vis-a-vis the Ilkhanid. So there's ongoing war, intermediate war between the Ilkhanid and the Golden Horde. And then there's the Chagatais further to the northeast, and of course the Sultan of Delhi, which we usually forget. I just want to note, and we don't have to talk about it anymore, that it's remarkable that we have two dynasties based on Turkish-speaking military slaves in two different parts of the Middle East, more or less at the same time. Something must have been happening in the Middle East. We don't have to talk about it now, but it's worth thinking that this causes in two different, completely different cultural milieux to develop. So that's interesting in itself. So here we have a little bit sort of Syria. Again, most of this map is surely known to all of you, and the border of the. Okay, this is really the border, and it's really a border. It's not just a sort of amorphous frontier. The Euphrates was a very convenient border between the Mongols to the east and the Mamluks to the west. More or less, with some exceptions, Albira, which is a very important fort now today in Turkey, was in a little enclave on the other side. And the border again, more or less the border today, Antioch, eventually part of the Mamluk state. We have a Turkish-speaking military political elite, mostly Turkish-speaking, and even those who weren't Turks end up speaking Turkish. Everybody has Turkish names. They dress differently. At a given time, I mean, I'm going to give an estimation, but I would say at a given time, anywhere between 20 and 30,000 Mamluks or people of Mamluk origin of Mamluk province. That's how they came to the Sultanate. So one generation, all the time, new Mamluks are coming in, several hundred new Mamluks a year. Some of them going through training with the Sultan, becoming the Sultan's Mamluks. Some of them becoming Mamluks of higher and lower officers. And at the age of 18, more or less, being freed from slavery. So they come as slaves, they're enslaved, they're converted to Islam. I don't think anybody had choice in the matter. In theory, you're not supposed to force anybody to convert to Islam, but I think it sort of happened en passant, without thinking about it too much. These young boys and young adolescents became Muslims as they were moving across the Mediterranean at some point. They get trained for several years, and then they get enrolled into the units of their patrons, those who bought them and educated them and freed them and then employ them. In principle, loyal to their masters and to each other. often, like anything else, there are rules, and then there's this prescriptive and then descriptive. But so what's important to mention is one is that they fought as large groups of mounted archers, and that way somewhat similar to the Mongols. I think it's what gave them their military advantage. And they worked through together with and through civilian elites. There's a very small Turkish-speaking military political elite that controls a large, mostly Arabic-speaking population in Syria and Egypt, and later on in northern Sudan, and later on in Libya and west and eastern Libya, and into the bottom corner of Anatolia, and of course the Hijaz, and indirectly controlling Yemen. It's quite an operation, and they do it through Arabic-speaking elites, bureaucrats, not all of them Muslims. And that's important to state in general, that not everybody's a Muslim. We got a little bit of that from Milka, and the claim is made, and I support it 100%. And I'm trying to strengthen that claim and prove it, is that the great wave, both in Egypt and Syria, certainly in Palestine, the final wave of Islamization takes place under the Mamluks. And they also are patrons and of the religious classes, but whether they're scholars or Sufis, and these are overlapping groups. The Mamluks saw themselves as good Muslims, or they saw themselves as loyal Muslims. They saw themselves as defenders of Islam. That's part of their self-identity, and they don't follow all the rules all the time in all places, but like real people in the real world too. You can identify with something without necessarily following all the rules. So there's some positive and some disparaging views towards the Mamluks. On the one hand, and this goes back to the Middle Ages. We find this in the Arabic sources too. The Mamluks stop the Mongols and throw them back across the Euphrates and keep it up for 60 years. They throw out the Crusaders. They defend Islam. They defend the Muslims. They're great patrons. There's no doubt about it. They're great patrons of learning and building and religious institutions and whatnot. On the other hand, there are, I would say, very, very recently, the consensus was among scholars and others that in terms of the economy, demography, settlement, intellectual life, it was a terrible time, and it got worse as time went on. A real negative view. I think I have here. So we have here some. Just to show, there's more to life than bows and arrows, of course. Then we show these beautiful. This is from a manuscript from the British Library, and it's a manual, or it purports to be a manual. I can't imagine anybody sitting on a horse and trying to read it, but it gives it's certainly a vicarious experience. Beautiful, and we sat with veterinarians. We sat with research veterinarians, and they said each horse is different. Somebody took the time to draw 4 different horses. So we see the young Mamluks. We know they're young because they don't have beards yet, and they're practicing their swordsmanship, working on the back of horses. And here we have learning the tricks of the trade from one's elders, and we see the older Mamluk training the younger Mamluk. And of course, they're very proud to be called Mamluks. Mamluk literally means possessed or ruled or controlled, meaning, in other words, a slave. But even afterwards, they're very proud to be called Mamluks because that's distinguishes them. If you didn't go through this bit of slavery, then you really can't be part of the elite. There's some exceptions, but you really that's the general rule. So here we're learning how to smack each other with poles and then turning into spears, of course. Now, older views of the Mamluks. Let's read this together. I think you'll enjoy this. Philip Hitti was a great historian. I mean, he was a pioneering historian, and I'm sure all of you have read his version of his translation of Osama ibn Munqidh, which has been now superseded by Paul Cobb's translation. But still, the last Mamluks were especially Sadla. They were one of the darkest histories in the history of the land. Some were so greedy and selfish as to monopolize sugar, spices, and other commodities, and realize excessive profits from their subjects. Can you believe it? Others were druggists, homosexuals, and depraved. The moral and political deterioration was not confined to the highest in their document. Emirs, which are really officers, I don't know what they officers, ambitious leaders, and chiefs of the bodyguards organized factions, started revolutions, and struggled to grasp all possible wealth and power. Okay, pretty negative. That's a pretty negative. I would say, of course, it reflects a time in the world that nobody would quite phrase it like this anymore. But here I'm going to from a way that Ashtur finished one of his great works. Okay, Now, Ashur was a great historian, and I have the greatest respect for him. And as I'm going to say, he combined, this leads us to the subject, he combined a deep reading of Western sources and thorough reading with command of the Arabic sources, and more than the Arabic sources too. Really, quite a respect for a remarkable guy. But it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything he wrote. But so here's how he complete. This is I think the last sentence of the social and economic history of the Near East in the Middle Ages. This, i.e., that is the later Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria, was the end of what had been the flower of civilization in Western Asia and the Mediterranean world. The flourishing economy of the Near East had been ruined by rapacious military, and its great civilizing achievements have been destroyed through inability to adopt new methods of production and new ways of life. Okay, also pretty it's a pretty strong accusation. I think that today, the last generation or so, we have a much more, say, nuanced view of the Mamluks, and that we see and may not necessarily have been so goddamn awful, okay, as it's portrayed. And one wonders exactly why that comes about, and how much it reflects, some sources say what they say, and of course, one reads, but one interprets the sources. I think a lot of it is, I'm not saying necessarily that Ashur is a victim of this, but a lot of what is in the Middle East, and we find it, by the way, this is remarkable. We find it among Arab historians, we find it among Western historians, we find it among Palestinian historians, we find it among Jewish Israeli historians. Everybody was against, everybody has something nasty to say about the Mamluks. So that maybe a positive thing in its own, that here we are, we all agree on something. I think there's an anti-Turkish discourse here. I think there's something anti-Turkish that goes, it's much more deep than this. And but how the Ottomans treated us. Again, Israeli discourse about the Ottomans is also very, very complex. It was 16th century, and then there's the 19th century. And there's a whole thing about Arab decline. And again, we could go on and on and on about Arab decline and what, if yes or no. I think the answer is no. That's why I refuse to use the term the golden age of Islam, the classical period. These are terms which have in my mind, have no meaning, or they're confusing. So a part of it is, and again, the Turks came, Persians came, then the Turks came, and they took over, and everything went bad. It was okay until the Turks came. And I just want to note, in Israel at least, we say the Turks, and we usually think 15, 16, the Ottomans come. These guys were Turks, and they called themselves Turks, and they're referred to as Turks. And the Mamluk state is not referred to as the Mamluk state; it's referred to as the Turkish state, Dawlat al-Turk or Dawlat al-Trak. So the ethnicity point is important. So this again is part of the maybe part. It's again not on a whole nother topic, but worth noting. So what we do have, and I'm gonna well, maybe I'll just mention this very briefly, and then we'll move on. Ashur's continuators and people who combine, and I could that's a whole lecture in itself. There's certainly in the last generation, even in the last half generation, several historians who combine a thorough knowledge of Arabic with a thorough use of European sources, medieval European sources, like Eric Vallet, Francisco Apalanés, who has a new book, which I just reviewed, and it's a remarkable book. And Gail Christ, Swiss. So we have a Frenchman and a Spaniard who writes in French, and Gail, who's Swiss and writes in many languages. They're doing really important work, and it's really opening up how we understand better the mechanisms of trade in the Mediterranean, and particularly Apollinaire makes it very, very clear that things weren't maybe so goddamn awful on that field of international trade as perhaps Ashur had suggested. But again, that's another discussion. What we do have, thank you, but we do have, I just want to mention also, Mamluk studies, of course, it has a history, and it has a history at this university with David Ayalon, but the last generation has seen several interesting things going on. I have here in Hebrew, I should have turned that into English, of course. But the Mamluk Studies Review and online Mamluk Bibliography, which is a remarkable tool, and Anna Rishkimo Kodex, where I spent 2 years, and the annual school of Mamluk Studies, you can believe it. And then, of course, Mamluk Studies in Israel, which is, I don't know, maybe thriving is too strong a word, but it's certainly okay, doing well enough. Moving on here, again, modern studies of the Mamluks, Esbumt, the Mamlukin portion, by Honerman and others who've talked about modern Mamluk studies. So that's another, again, if one wants to pursue that, that's another way to pursue it. However, let's get to historiography, which is our main theme today. So one thing I want to mention is that the idea of history as a discipline, tarikh, is something that's very clear. And people know there's such a subject as tarikh. Those of you who are Hebrew speakers know the word tarikh as a date. And obviously these two words are related, even if they have slightly different spellings. And there's mu'arikh, or mu'arikhun, historians. People are called mu'arikh, al-mu'arikh, the historians. Okay, so this is a subject. This is nobody had, as far as I know, nobody really had made a living as an historian. They all had day jobs as bureaucrats and as ulama, as some of them even as mamluks. There's one or two who actually were mamluk officers. But they wrote a lot of history, and it's really remarkable. So you stand at the National Library, not down the block here, and you look at Dhahabi's Tarikh al-Islam, the history of Islam, 70 volumes. How did anybody write 70? How did he copy out 70 volumes, let alone write it, compose it? It's just beyond me how these people worked. And most of them are shorter, 12 volumes, 30 volumes, but they're still impressive works. And there's a lot of it. There's a lot of Mamluk historiography. And it's one aspect of I would call a fairly vibrant intellectual life. And for the life of me, I don't understand why people can think that this is a time of intellectual decay, if there is such a thing. But it's a time certainly of a lot of intellectual and cultural production, and much of it of the highest quality. And historiography is, I wouldn't say the height of it, but it's certainly one of the things to be proud of for this period, or one of the things to be aware of. And a lot of people are writing history, and they define themselves as history. It's defined as history. It's not what we as historians use. No, and again, as I say, there's non-historical work that are useful for historians, very useful for historians, I would even say, but it's used by it's self-defined, self-conscious history. And of course, we have chronicles, an enormous corpus of chronicles, which are dependent on each other. It doesn't mean you don't have to read them all, or at least when you're looking at a particular subject, read everything, because somebody's going to say something that wasn't found somewhere else. Okay. But they composed usually of events, usually in chronological order, sometimes starting off who's ruling where, and sometimes extremely detailed. So at least, of course, who do they deal with? They deal with the kings, and they deal with the elites, and they deal with the religious elites, and they deal with things in the city. They don't usually deal with the countryside. That's a problem, but they sometimes do. There's some information there about the countryside too. Some of them are universal in scope. They're not world history. We get world history at this time, but not among the Mamluks. Maybe the closest we get is Ibn Khaldun at the end of the 14th century. He's not originally from the Sultanate anyway, but we certainly get in the Mongol world. We get a universal. We really get world history. First attempts at world history. We're not getting world history here yet, but we are getting sometimes going back, and this goes back to early Muslim historiography from the creation. And so, of course, once Muhammad shows up, the Prophet Muhammad shows up, then it becomes Muslim history, mainly Muslim history, but not unconcerned about other peoples at other times in a non-systematic way, but still there. We have dynastic histories of this or that dynasty, again, looking at what the larger context, but focused in on one dynasty. We have local histories dealing with a country or a region or one particular city. All of them very, very useful. All of them very, very useful. Certainly, we can reestablish a political, military, diplomatic chronology with some ease. We have biographical dictionaries, which is also a phenomenon which we got. Others will be talking about this, and I won't go into it too much. But I'll just give an example. Safadi, and we hear the name Safadi, so he's from Safad, Sfat, up north. His father was a Mamluk. He himself was a sort of middle level bureaucrat. Beautiful, beautiful Arabic, wide horizons. He writes published in 33 volumes. His great biography, a smaller one too, of contemporaries. 33 volumes. I mean, like 10,000 biographies. It's remarkable, and it has a lot of, unlike earlier biographical dictionaries, full of Mamluks, like hundreds and hundreds of Mamluks are described there, and dozens of Mongols, and if I'm not mistaken, 9 Franks. Okay. And I meant, and I forgot, but our colleague over in political science, Wael Abu-Uqsa, some of you know, when at an early stage, he was studying history of Middle Eastern studies, and I was really hopeful he was going to do with us, stick with us. I don't know what happened. He's someone with a rough crowd, and then next thing you know, he's doing political science. But anyway, he's over there in political science now. But he published his seminar paper they wrote for me about the Franks of this that. What do we learn about the Franks in this dictionary and this biographical dictionary? So it's really something else. And of course, we have single biographies, Baibars, Kalaun, and other Mamluk sultans, and sometimes not only sultans. So they're of course very, very useful too. We have historically informed works which are again remarkable sometimes. We have, for instance, Nuwayri's encyclopedia. It's only also like 32 or 33 volumes long, of which half of its history really a chronicle. So they're more than historically informed. While Umari, actually, his chronicle is not very important, but he has remarkable information about everything, including the Franks, and I'm going to touch upon that later in a bit. Al-Kashandi has all kinds of documents, which he cites, documents which he cites. We have chancery manuals, which of course cite documents. We have geographical works of various types, including travel logs, but not only have sort of scientific geography or descriptive geography too. We have non-historical works which are very, very useful, particularly legal texts, which are including collections of fatwas of these responsa, which are full of things including relating to the Franks at times. We have belles lettres, which are again full of information, and one reads them as critically. One doesn't accept everything that's written in some of these stories, but one they have a lot to tell us too, and of course intellectual history, which can be useful too. We have again inscriptions in numismatics, which I mentioned. Primary sources, we don't have a lot of archives. In fact, we don't have any archives. Okay, we don't have anything resembling what you have in Genoa or Florence or Venice or anywhere else in Italy and other cities where systematic archives that have somehow survived, sometimes from Outremer, from the Crimea or from Palestine, the Teutonic Knights, the records of the Teutonic Knights, none of that survived. And there's a whole discussion about why it hasn't survived. And some scholars have suggested that maybe they never existed, mostly never existed for various reasons, that somehow the Islamic State managed without systematic archives. Interesting discussion. I will note that what we do find, the one sort of set of documents, we find basically two sets of things. One is documents which are cited, it's not an archive, but we have plenty of these documents quoted extensively or sometimes completely in various other works, particularly both the chronicles and the encyclopedias, etc. And we have waqfiyas, we have waqf endowment documents that have come down, which are sometimes the size of a book. They're really quite remarkable, and they tell us a lot about the land that this is very helpful for country rule. So that we do, we have to see the strong points. So somebody working in, say, the history of the Franks and Alexandria, like a Polonaise. So he's working extensively on the one hand with text from European archives, Venetian archives especially, and at the same time he's reading very carefully Arabic sources, and occasionally there are mentions. There is an interface between these two, and threading complex and sophisticated history. Okay, moving on. Okay, I'm going to give a case study here, and this is why we have to be, and this touches upon the Crusaders, France in general. Okay, now all of us, let's cut to the bottom here of all of us are familiar certainly by the name of Makrizi, and it's a very good addition. Makrizi died in 1442. He's probably, if I were to have a blind quiz right now and ask around a piece of paper and say, write the name of one Mamluk historian, I am sure that 98% of you would write the name Makrizi, whether you come from Arabic studies or Crusader studies or whatever. Makrizi is well known, partially because of Katremer's decent translation, which is particularly important because of his footnotes. His footnotes are very, very useful, very, very erudite. Makrizi is a good addition. Translation is also an earlier translation, or a translation of the earlier text, the Ayyubid period too. It's basically a history of Egypt from the Ayyubids on. Okay, Egypt and by extension Syria too. Everybody cites it all the time, and I'm going to tell you now that you should be very, very careful when you cite it for the period that we're interested in. I'll explain to you why. Okay, I'm going to mention here Ibn Abd al-Zahir, who wrote a biography of Baibars. He was Baibars' head secretary, head of the chancellery, and he wrote his biography. It's certainly a biography of. I've got 15 minutes. Yeah. Okay, I'll be fine. Okay, he wrote an important. I mean, he was there. He was there, and he wrote some of the documents that he cites. Some of the letters that were written to this and that one. And we heard that from Anne. Is Anne here? Oh, there. Yeah. Sorry, you came in late. I didn't see you come in. Okay. So Anne touched upon that. So he's still considered a master of Arabic style. He's still referred to as somebody who, I don't know if should be imitated, but can be appreciated even today. Okay. So his biography of Baibars and then there's Ibn al-Farad. Okay, you're going to see how this all comes together in a minute. Okay, Ibn al-Farad is well known to us because of that wonderful selection, very, very careful translations, and very, very copious notes. The careful translations by Ursula and what's his first name? Lyons. Malcolm. Sorry, thank you. Malcolm Lyons, and then Rodney Smith. Remarkable copious notes. It's so useful. Everybody cites it all the time. Okay, and rightfully so. Okay, but it's just the icing on the cake or the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg. Okay, and I'll explain to you why in a second. Okay, so what I'm going to claim is that we should never use Makrizi whatsoever. Okay, this is my advice to you. This is what I want you all to know. Don't use Makrizi for the period for the late Mamluk period. Oh, I'm sorry, for the late Crusader period, the early Mamluk period, and I'll tell you why. You have to look at them, of course, because there are a couple lines which are not found anywhere else. But my claim is, and I think I proved it pretty well too, and I published about this. Anybody's interested, I'll send you the article. Okay, my claim is as follows. Okay, Ibn al-Zahir is one of the main sources for Ibn al-Farad. Okay, Ibn al-Farad takes from all kinds, including Ibn Wasl, all kinds of people, and he almost invariably mentions his sources. And not only that, he says, I'm citing it completely, literally, or I'm just summarizing. He's a wonderful historian. He's a wonderful, by the way, let's go back here for a second. As we can see, this is one of the few Mamluk texts which is yet to be published properly. Okay, I mean, we have the bits and pieces that Riley Smith and Lyons did. Okay, on the one hand. On the other hand, we have later editions. I have one of the later editions here. So the edition that the late period of Baibars and then running into Qarun's period is already volume 7. Okay. But it's not easily accessible. So we can be excused, guilty with an explanation, as the old joke goes. But my claim is, and I literally did it during my dissertation. I literally sat there with the microfilm of Ibn al-Farad in front of me, and the text of Makrizi on the left, and the text of Ibn al-Zahir on the right. And I literally compared every line, every word for 21 years. Okay. And the result was I came to the conclusion that 99% of the time, Makrizi is summarizing, sometimes quoting, but usually summarizing Ibn al-Farad, who is taking from Ibn al-Zahir. And not only that, and this is my resistance, so to speak, I claim that Makrizi does a lousy job. And if he was a student of ours, he would get a 7. Okay, he would get a very low grade. And one case study was the Battle of Ain Jalut. He made a complete mess of what Ibn al-Farad presents us. A complete mess. And we've been reading that for years and trying to understand it, trying to make sense of it. And I can go on and on about this, but I won't do that now. But if anybody's interested, I'll send you the papers. Okay, just let me know. I'll send you the papers. Okay, so again, we have to read everything. The Mamluk sources, we have to strive to read everything, because you never know what's going to come up. And I found 1 or 2 or 3 stories in this 21 years, whatever, of reading this that I couldn't find in but maybe I missed it in this copious manuscript, not a particularly good script. I missed something or I didn't miss something, and he added it. He did add something. I know one story where he clearly added that I didn't find it in his, and maybe it comes from the winery. But other historians, and why are you writing at the beginning of the 14th century? Baibars al-Mansuri, his contemporary, who happens to be, as you can hear from the name, he's an officer, he's a senior officer. How he learned Arabic, and he writes very highfalutin Arabic too, very, very impressive Arabic. So he may have had some, research assistant or something who did some of the writing, or a ghostwriter. I don't know, but actually I do know. But anyway, the point is that others will cite Ibn Abdul Zahir directly, and others, as I said, Ibn al-Furat, and then Makrizi indirectly. So basically, we're reading Makrizi, we're reading a watered down version of Ibn Abdul Zahir. Ibn Abdul Zahir was a contemporary. The advantage is he's there. He's not a military man. So sometimes when he's describing military affairs, when he describes the siege of Arsul, he really makes a mess of it because he just doesn't understand what's going on. But he writes a lot about it. Okay. So anyway, that's one of the points I'm trying to make here. Now, another question is how do the Mamluks, how do they know? What do they know about the Franks? How can they know about the Franks? So of course, there's this ongoing contact with them, and even times struggles, fights, battles. There's a lot of coming back and forth, diplomatic and otherwise. There are prisoners to be interrogated and talked to. There are merchants going back and forth across the Mediterranean, and of course within the Levant itself, including Muslims traveling, and also. But I can imagine that somebody took the time in Alexandria or in Damascus or somewhere else to sit and talk, and afterwards went back and wrote it down and gave it to somebody else and they're spies. And one of the things that I find extremely interesting is how extensive and organized, and again, a separate topic altogether, the Mamluk espionage, foreign espionage service was. Again, you're fighting this existential war with the Mongols on the one hand, and a difficult and dangerous war with the Armenians and with the Franks, and you don't have a choice. Now, I know about spies in the Frankish, in the Levant. And I know about, certainly among the Mongols, they talk about being at the Mongol royal camp, coming to spies at the Mongol royal camp. I know about them among the Armenians. I don't know about spies across the Mediterranean. That I have no firm information, but information comes, which we're going to see in a minute. And it's there's no getting around it. I mean, that somehow they knew. As I mentioned, we don't have the archives that we would like with regarding the Mamluks. Okay, I'm going to give three examples now of texts indicative of three different periods. So first of all, I'm going to start with the Battle of Mansoura. And this is the text is beautifully rendered in Ibn al-Furat, and in the Lyons Riley Smith edition translation, well translated, very evocative, very, very evocative. Okay, and but it's clear that Ibn al-Furat has taken his work from a contemporary. Ibn al-Furat died in 1405. He's writing in the end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th century. He takes it from Ibn Wasil, who we all know. He dies later towards the end of the 13th century, but he's a contemporary, and he's an active. He's a Syrian who's been living in Egypt, and he's an important official, and he gets along well with the Mamluks too. So okay. So it's clearly he has something good to say about the Mamluks here. Okay. So you all remember the Battle of Mansoura, and you all remember how the Crusaders crossed one morning and found the Mamluks found the Muslims not ready. And the Sultan is already dead, but they're trying to keep it a secret. I can't believe that it was really a secret, but they kept it a secret, as if it was a secret. And the commander, okay, Fakhruddin ibn Shayukh comes out, and he's half naked because the morning, and he gets cut down. It's a battle is tough. The situation looks bad, and the Franks have moved into the city, actually into the township, the fortified town of Mansoura, and the source says things look pretty bad, guys. It's like Islam is doomed, basically. And then the Turkish band, Mamluks of the Sultan, may God have mercy on him because he's dead. Okay, from the Jamadariya and the Bahriya, these are, we'll go into that too. Lions of war and horsemen were masters of the use of lance and bow, appeared on the scene. They launched a concerted attack against the Franks, violently rocking their pillars, demolishing their structure, and overturning their crosses. So the imagery is of buildings, but it's clear that they're structure of the army. The Turkish swords and maces wreaked havoc with them, inflicting death and wounds and threw them down in the alleys, in the ground in the alleys of Al-Mansur. Now they're not fighting here with bows and arrows, and the Crusaders are not attacking with the lances underneath their arms and masses 100, 200. It's fighting in the streets with rocks and knives and axes and God knows what, and a lot of blood is being shed. Okay, and when it's all over and finally we can sort of breathe, we the Muslims can breathe. I don't know about you, the Crusaders, but we the Muslims can breathe. It's a great line here, a great line. Okay, and it's a line that appears in Ibn al-Furat too, so you're perhaps all familiar with it. Okay, this was the first. It's a kind of complex sentence too. This is the first encounter with the polytheistic dogs were defeated by means of the Turkish lands. وكانت هذه أول واقعة انتصر فيها بأسود الترك على كلاب الشرك. Okay, so first of all, I remember once I presented this to a group of high school students at the University High School and Smart Alex. So they said to me, how can the Christians be shirk? How can they, how can they're not polytheists, but I had to explain that to them. But anyway, the point is that first of all, it's the first time one thinks about the second time, third time, fourth time, fifth time. This shows why the Muslims are able to, why they, Muslim elites and the Arabic speakers in general, in the cities and towns and villages and the tribes, put up with the Mamluks. Okay, they're weird. They have weird names. They speak a weird language. They look funny, and they give us a hard time. But they do the business. They do the job. They keep away the enemies of the Muslims. So very, very, this is very instructive for, first of all, what it has to say about the Franks, and secondly about what it says about the Mamluks and why we support the Mamluks, why we put up with them, basically put up with their rule. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, okay, you all know the story here too. I'm sure all of you know now. Now, when I was working on my dissertation, basically Mongol relations, and I was trying to figure out, role the Crusaders, the Franks, the Franks in the East and the Franks in the West play a certain role. And there's some very, very, very good research literature about this. And of course the Peter Jackson's The Mongols in the West pulls it all together very nicely and makes an important contribution in his own right. So I said to myself, what am I going to do here? What's my job? My job, and I don't have the tools to read sources sit and go through old sources and old sources in Old French and in Italian, old Italian dialects and Latin, let alone Latin. That's not my job. I'm not prepared for that. But I can read the Arabic, and I read a lot of Arabic, and I read a lot of these sources. So maybe here and there, and this is what I did. I found, what do the Mamluks know about these connections? That was interesting. What do the Mamluks know about these connections between the Mongols and the Franks? So here and there, they knew. Again, partially based on their espionage, I think. So in the year 668, which is 1269-70, and you know the story. James I of Barcelona has decided to, or at least he says he's launching a crusade. He's also communicating with the Bible. I have no idea what he really thinks. Is he playing a double game, or is he doing? I don't know. That's an interesting question itself. So anyway, a group of Western Franks came to Acre and reported to the king of Aragon, Rey d'Aragon, Rey de Aragon, or something like that. That's what the Arabs could do with what they're hearing. We get that a lot too. That's also a very, very interesting matter. Again, we'll talk about it another time. The Aragonese king had also sent an envoy to Abaka. They know that they had sent it to Abaka, the Mongol Ilkhan. Okay, and he was coming to meet him as arranged, and that the rendezvous would be in the region of Kilikia and Armenia. However, his flotilla was struck by wind, which destroyed many of his ships, and just a few showed up. Two of his bastard sons showed up with a few things, and they had a look around and went back. Nothing came of this whatsoever. Okay, but they're aware, and I have many other temples. They're aware of communication both of the Franks in the Levant and the Franks in the West, the kings, that they're in communication with the Mongols, and they're planning a joint campaign. And this, I will say it in a simple way: they were scared the pants out of the Mamluks. Okay, they were very concerned. They said, okay, we can stop the Mongols and we can stop the Franks, but together that might be a little bit too much. So that's I'm going to get to that in a minute. Okay, I'll finish. Okay, so of counterfactual history or counterfactual sort of thinking. around 1340, Ibn Fadl al-Umari, in his great work of great encyclopedia, full of stuff. And we're just cutting, really scratching the surface of it now. He writes in his description of the Franks, he said, if Al-Malik al-Ashraf Khalil ibn Kalaun, had not cleansed the country of the Franks, meaning taken an acre and then throw out the rest of them, nothing's left, and not taken upon himself the duty during his reign to rid any remnant of them there, then in 699, 1299, 1300, when the Sultan Mahmud Ghazan, the Mongol, came, that something fell out here. Came in control of the country and destroyed the inhabitants, taking advantage of the absence of the Mamluk army and the distance of the Mamluk commanders and the disagreement among the Muslims. And he goes on to say this would have been the end, because these Franks would have taken full advantage of that and destroyed them. That would have been it, at least in Syria. Rule in Syria would have been lost. So I have to check this again and throw it out. So I did this very quickly. Anyway, that's the point I'm trying to make. So why does this important? Now, by the way, I can't help it. The editor was Michele Amari, and when I was in Firenze, in one of the neighborhoods, I saw Michele Amari Street, so I thought that was pretty cool. Of course, he was also the first minister of education in the Italian Republic, but it's another matter. I like to think it's because of his work as an Orientalist and Arabist. Streets are named after him. So why is this important here? And this is what I'm going to pull it all together here now. So we come to the matter of policy. I can say that very early on, the Mamluks have adopted an extremely bellicose, very truculent policy towards the Franks, and much more truculent than we see with the Ayyubids overall. Certainly after Saladin, the Ayyubids reacted, but the Mamluks have a consistent anti-Frankish policy, which we all know about, and that, by 1291 to the end of the Frankish entity in the East. And I think this was derived, at least in part, I've made this argument in the past, that the Mongols and the Franks, both local and in Outremer, were in contact. The Mamluks knew this, and they knew they were planning a campaign against them or cooperation against them. And they said, we gotta put an end to this. And the way to put an end to it is to systematically take apart the crusading entity in the East. And secondly, what did the Mamluks do? As they captured fortified Frankish cities on the coast, they destroyed them. Which is the basis of Iris's and my project. What happens afterwards? What's left, and what do they remember, etc. But very clearly, they said we're not going to leave them out, and we want to make it very difficult for them to have a bridgehead. We're going to throw them out, and we're not going to waste our troops in the coast. We're not going to waste our money on rebuilding forts that we can't man properly. And I think there was long-term awareness of the possible return of the Franks too. And I think there's a rich literature about the recovery of the Holy Land, which we'll get into, but in which the idea of economic blockage is stressed. And I think the Mamluks were aware of this, and it also dictated, at least into the early part of the 14th century, their policy. They did their best to strengthen their ties with the Byzantines and the Genoese, and it becomes more and more clear as we get closer to the end of the 13th century. The Genoese are very important as shippers and perhaps merchants of young Mamluks, and that's the lifeline. That's the of the Mamluk state, is the constant influx of young Mamluks. And of course, encouraging the transient trade via Egypt and trade between the Sultanate and Europe, particularly once later on in the 14th century, as the blockade that was never fully carried out, but the blockade called by the Pope gradually came to an end. In short, taking the Franks into account, be they crusaders or residents in the Levant, merchants, potential crusaders and rulers or whatever, all this is a very important part of understanding the Mamluks. So we don't have Mamluk history without crusader history or Frankish history, if you wish. I would suggest also understanding the Mamluks seems like a pretty good idea, so we can better comprehend the Franks in the Mediterranean and their ongoing attempt at, I'll call it a drang nach Osten, push to the east. In any case, the Mamluk sources are a good way to find out about how the Mamluks and their civilian elites thought about the Franks and how this informed their policies and actions. So here we are, the Mamluks were born in Israel. This is, to my mind, the only stamp in the world devoted to the Mamluk postal system. There we go. And finally, here we go. Enjoy your stay in Jerusalem and go visit Bibar Street. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruben. We have some time for questions or comments.
Maybe while we're asking questions and making comments. Positive comments, but so I just want to pass around a couple books. First of all, some of you are Arabists, read Arabic.
I read Arabic.
Or Arabs.
I read Arabic.
It's so I'm just passing around, but for those of you who've never held an Arab book in your hand, here we go. This is even of the Zahir's biography, and just pass it around, have a quick look, and so you get a sense of what this is about. The other thing is when I was 14 years old, I read Jews and Arabs by Goitein. And I think that had a role. This is not the copy that I read. I got this here this way. But this is a remarkable work, and I recommend this work to everybody. If you're at all interested in the Mediterranean, and I think yes, you are. This is the book you have to read and give your students to read. And one cannot praise it enough. Okay. Okay. So.
Yeah.
Yes, they call them Turks. Yes, they call them Turks. And again, this is we have a colleague in Beersheba, in Bar Ilan, Kobe Youssef. Some of you know Kobe. Kobe's a great Arabist and really nice guy and great scholar. But we have a disagreement. He attributes a lot of importance to the ethnicity of the Mamluks. And it's important, but it's among other things. We can look at inter-ethnic struggles among the Mamluks themselves. But they all saw themselves, say, grosso modo, compared to everybody else, they were Turks. Even if they weren't born a Turk, you had to learn Turkish was the lingua franca of the Mamluks. They all had Turkish names. They spoke Turkish. And some of them, on the one hand, you get somebody like Baybars al-Mansuri, who evidently clearly fluent in High Arabic too. And then you get others, Kalaun, Sultan Kalaun, they say they never learned Arabic properly. It couldn't match. And I presume the majority of Mamluks were sort of in between. They get by in Arabic. None of them were, most of them weren't great scholars. They probably could recite some Qurans, things like that, but they did what they did in Turkish most of the time. Later on, they're from the Caucasus. Okay, the Mamluks in the beginning are almost invariably, I would say 90%, grosso modo, from the steppes of southern Russia, southern Ukraine of today. Okay, so where all these battles are taking place and all the drones are flying and whatever, that's where that used to be an area almost completely of Turkish-speaking nomads. There's still the remnants of that are the Tatars of the Volga, and also the Tatars of Crimea. That's the remnants of those Turkish-speaking populations. I mean, I can go into that. That's a whole, again, another conversation. Okay.
I just wanted to ask, if I may, in terms of being worried about the return of the Franks or the return of the Europeans, how much is that present in Mamluk writings?
Well, that's something.
Where do you find it?
That's something I'm looking at now. That's part of our project. Okay, so thank you for reminding me. That's something I want to look at, and I want to look at and see how that informs their looking at the past. How that for talking about 1260 or talking about 1291. The general the feeling I have is that the sense of impending doom, which accompanies the Mamluk Sultanate through the beginning of the 14th century, ends around 1320. The war with the Mongols comes to an end. Official peace is made. Then 15 years later, the United Mongol state of Iran falls apart in a smaller state, so that there's no longer any existential danger. And I think they took it seriously, but the things change. The army changes, and I would say that it loses much of its cutting edge. There are all kinds of they experiment with different forms of. They keep the Mamluk system, but they experiment with different ways of Mamluk education. There's a lot more preoccupation with luxurious living. The good old days are over in that sense. So I think that it was in the back of their minds, and they were ready for it some way or another, but it wasn't something that preoccupied them too much. And then of course it's the 15th century. On the other hand, we know that the complicated relationship with Cyprus and the eventual, basically the Mamluk raged to Cyprus, some of them less successful, more successful than others. Eventually, they conquered Cyprus, or gained control of it, and Cyprus became a Mamluk protectorate. That's in the 15th century. So I think that they were aware of the closer Franks. You know, I think that was something that was probably in their, and of course, you know, dealing with as the Venetians become increasingly more important in the 15th century, and they become the dominant group in dealing with Genoese don't disappear, and other groups exist too, and the Florentines try to move into, not with great success. But they're very much concerned about the ongoing trade is very, very important for them for keeping the state together.
Adam, please.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned that, you know, the Mamluks had a complicated relationship with the Kingdom of Cyprus. I just wanted to ask, how and why did Cyprus escape that sort of systematic destruction that the Mamluks inflicted on the Levantine Franks, given their existential fear of a Frankish-Mongol alliance at that time?
Well, okay, the Mamluks, I've suggested. I think that the Mamluks were fairly realistic and fairly rational.
Mhm.
And I think they realized they have, you know, like anybody else, any other group of people, any individual, any group, you have limited resources, and you think most people, most of the time, use them rationally.
Mhm.
I think they probably thought they taking over in the end of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century was beyond their abilities.
Okay.
You know, just the same reason they made a lot of talk about invading and taking over Baghdad again. They never really tried it in any serious way. You know, the rhetoric was often very, very, very militant, but they were very, very careful not to jump too high or too far. When they finally decided in the 15th century, reality had changed, and I think that the fear of an invasion, of a returning crusade was much less at all. And again, it's something I want to look at more carefully. And also it played a role. It played a role as a forward, you know, banks and the trade and everything like that. It was an important spot for ongoing trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. So they didn't want to have a scorched earth there. I don't think that time. We all know the story. When is it 1270, 1271? Bibar's Anne talked about this. You know, that letter that he writes. It was a real fiasco.
Yeah.
It was a real fiasco, Mamluk fiasco, and Bibar, Bibar, was not to be proud of. He tries to put a happy face on it, and writes that remarkable letter that Anne talked about. It really is. It's a great letter, but it's a great document, and it's very entertaining too. But it's really, it's very embarrassing. But on the other hand, they said, listen, our protection is for everybody is provided by a large mobile field army of mounted archers. That's how we keep, and that's why we don't build a wall around Jerusalem, basically. Some of you were in Jerusalem this morning in the old city, and the wall we see is an Ottoman wall. It wasn't there. There was no wall for 256 years. There was no wall under the Mamluks and beforehand under the Ayyubids, because they didn't want to waste money on it. They built the citadel. They fixed it up a little bit, but that's a symbol of power and whatever. But they didn't want to waste money on it. What defends Jerusalem is not the wall, but it's the fact that nobody can get close to it because of this large field army, and they didn't waste money on where they wanted to, where it was important. They rebuilt fortification and they manned the forts properly. Where it wasn't important, they destroyed fortification, let them decay, and certainly didn't put any significant garrisons there.
Before we take a break, just tell us where the street is, and then we'll reconvene at 10:35.
Well, I could say it's for me to know and you to find out, but it's next to the Ambassador Hotel. And in fact, I discovered it, and I discovered it I was getting the car. We went to eat at the Ambassador Hotel, and I get the car, and my wife standing there smiling, and he says, "Look what we found! It was there, So so now I'm the expert. But anyway, it's really something else. I use the slide a lot when I'm abroad. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
we're having a coffee break until 10:35, so that will give us enough time to operate the machine and do whatever else you need and.
Yeah, from myself.
Historian, apart from
Umari had, yeah, it has no kind of documentation, and I think truth, I had a friend who a long time ago, never kept a person to retranslate that and have an annotated edition with really.
I would love that because I have read that before I did all experience translation.
Yeah, yeah, that's, you know, that's an interesting topic. When do the islands become part of the, seriously part of the Mamba consciousness? That's something that we should, that's one word, that's another make project. Each size, I need also. מה?
לקחת את זה פה?
כן, כן, שזה... לא? כן, פה. שלי פה.
President, I just wanted to thank you for your response. Cyprus is a little bit outside of my scope. I'm mostly 12th century Jerusalem, but I've taken an interest in Mamluk studies. I had the good fortune of studying a little bit with Yosef Rappaport. He did a very good job at giving me a good introduction. Yes.
Just what?
Yes.
Listening to my show, my do research.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The earrings, by the way, that was not next to you, saw this. Piece of art is also must have been.
I had the good fortune to see this was the beginning of that. I'm from the Detroit area in Michigan. So I'm currently studying at the University. I'm with Jay Rubenstein, though I did do some work with Allison Bonta. She was on my. Okay.
She has a.
Not the forensic.
She was on my committee until she, moved up to the fire. At Columbia. Yes. Yes. We took care of Armenian studies.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm not sure. I think she might get a position kind of like,
You have the mouse?
Modern art museum.
Yes.
But they kind of.
I may have-
shift.
Everybody always trying
Usually happens with kippers, they're really kind of.
But I have mine now too.
Thanks, Ruben.
Sorry about the Hebrew, it was for the students as the way, so. Because they published, you know, the script, and the articles.
Jesus.
Might have gotten everything. Oh, yeah.
But Allison Vaca definitely looks my Islamic historiography in the shape while preparing for my exam.
A reference, okay,
Okay.
and that, and speak to them, they're,
Yes.
it's an amazing team.
It is one that's
This
on
is,
my
this is the ones.
to read shelf as well. Perhaps one
So
that I
that's
can
before
focus
cleaning,
on.
that's after cleaning.
This is what you also.
And it was.
I focus on
There's not enough from there.
expressions of kingship.
Otherwise you won't have this.
This sort of.
Part of the.
What's that? Yes, yes. Particularly trying to answer the question, what did it mean to be king in Jerusalem during It's all time, all those certain way.
Okay, thank you.
So coins you.
They no longer have, you know,
This
any
work?
leadership in the states go around.
This is.
But it's before everything fell apart. So we sort of had a time to think abstract about what.
Okay.
So this is one that have the forensic.
You know,
So we
Jesus
can
died,
basically.
so
sort of reconstruct the
I'm working under the direction of
Under the
Jesus this
gate.
time, so.
And that's part of the stuff for my students.
Yes.
It's not, but so you can see it was analyzed by Sam ED. It's electronic microscope.
I did my undergrad in
Gives you,
A&M.
the different, the material which is composed of, that you can see that there's.
Yeah,
this
just general history.
This might actually cover.
Hussein Fancy is my.
There are no, and
And then I had the good fortune of
traces
having a
today,
place with
but
Michael
there is
Barner.
maybe it could be, that's one of my theories, because it was found very close to the other cross, which is made from silver. Could have been that there was a connection.
Okay, very good.
Now, we didn't find the bodies, okay?
I'm very good.
So it could be that the context of those finds actually relates to some, I don't know, a small box treasure, you know, and something that was, I don't know, ransacked from my body, you know. But this has reference one.
I had to
in the
focus
world in
much
which it's,
very generally, so I wasn't able to
Byzantine
tie
in style,
too deeply.
but, the reference
Islamic
is
history as
that
much as I would have liked.
was bought in Egypt, okay? So we still have a lot of work to do on this one, but just think that for those who found.
You're right.
This could be part of the buckle, but it could also be some sort of a locking mechanism. Small treasure box.
This one,
Yeah,
I have to check my notes, but it looks quite similar to something in the V&A.
it was also, you have an amazing reference on the distribution. You can see you were in Aqua yesterday.
Yeah.
So when you just entered the central prison, you can see it. They refer to the business of course. I'm doubtful about this. I think it's something which in terms of date, I think. So, but the fact that you came from this. But you find them here. Now, this is one, you see that you can actually see
That's there.
that's the hit. You can actually see the angle of the blade. If the strike came from the right side, then it had to be flipped on one chest, okay? So, and that's, we did a special silicone they're using. Reaction and the material, and you can see that's silicone, you can actually see the negative of the blade itself. Okay, the blade, and you can almost reconstruct the angle of the blade. So now I have a process of putting it all together and basically my point, a small article like this, with the guys from the police and with my co-director, but I'd be more than happy to show you this information if you want some. I'll speak with Gibson. I'm probably meeting today my co-director.
Yeah.
Graphic material.
I thought it said I'd like to.
Okay, so
Yeah,
this
that's
is.
great. Have you got my emails?
You can run it down, and that would be wonderful. I know what's up. That's graffiti, that's a different, different.
That's great. Thanks. You write it down. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not smiling. It's what Thomas would call my cutting face.
I'm going to say that.
No, it's what my son says. Not what I say.
I do. Very nice.
Exactly.
But it's wonderful in this earlier.
You've been filming.
Yeah. Depending on what I express it, that's what oh, fine. You want to chip in with that, helps with that.
Yeah.
Well, we all, I was gonna say, can we just agree? We'll take it.
How you doing? Hope you was that
Okay.
yeah, but she sent me the draft of our asking of the no problem. Working on something that is I will show it to you. It's quite it's a fascinating case study. Just, yes, we found yes, that's you. Let me show you just
Because they're really excited about the book you gave.
okay.
Yes,
Okay.
and it will be published in English. Or in Hebrew.
It was just published yesterday, actually. So if you give me your email,
Yes.
I'll send it to you. It was
I will send.
So she works in an NGO that tries to,
here. That's an inscription.
She looks like the one in Rockefeller Museum.
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
But the one over there is white. So here, this is how it was found in the counter of this kiosk.
In the, okay.
Of this booth, like drinks booth, and next to popsicles was dismantled. And originally, here that's 3D reconstruction. I don't think I've added the. Let me see if I have the reconstruction of it. Just a second. Which one would it be?
It's quite big. So that's all you try to organize right into your
That's the original. This is where we excavate in Ashkelon, where reconstruction is.
Right. Oh, yeah.
It was part of
You could
Israel's,
write it. Like we. Yeah.
so to show you the location here. See the negative?
Okay.
But
Yeah, but I think it's.
Took us some time to realize
We're
this,
doing it last time.
that's another one.
Thank you.
Here,
Yeah.
see, this is how.
Okay.
we can go now.
I will come back.
So we send you, I will send you. Several papers which came out, some of them are more general, yesterday, it's a paper which deals with all the implications of the starting period. The Ayubic period, 75 pages, until the period of occupied land.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I was planning to with my colleague to reaction and you check because I know.
Still a fire.
I'm still trying to work out.
Yeah. It's this church. We are doing. But not much from the press over there. Very, very.
Do you mind if I tweet you, Jonathan, when you get going at some point?
There's one thing I'd rather didn't tweet.
There's don't sample them
Down
without,
Oh, right.
You'll get it.
Yes.
So not that bit. It's very.
it's in the church that I'm excavating in Ashton. So, yeah, originally, it's when you're working with architects. What's nice about it is it was a paragraph set in the late Byzantine period, but at some stage it was used as a tombstone. I can show you this. Those are this is how, first of all, in Ashkelon 1, you can find, there is an article about the church, about the frescoes, and the inscription. Some of the Greek history. There are also Arab inscriptions, which you can find in the Echelon. And this is how it looked like when he was so we have four church which I don't understand why people must be first, because this is the example which
That way. Always flooded out.
our inscription.
Doesn't bother me. No, I can't. Yeah. I mean, it's not good there. Should we give the? Yeah.
Because they've actually was since then almost everything.
Together.
About 4 years ago.
Yeah.
It's a paper published by a guy from the University of Dublin. About specifically about the arts, about the artistic style of
See that the breaks are becoming more and more fun, but we do have to work. So, it's my pleasure. Work to Professor Jonathan Phillips, who will explain why I have the screen now. So, does handout going around?
Two handouts,
Two
yeah.
handouts going around, and Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, great to see everybody here. Glad everybody made it here this morning. Oh yes, this picture. Well, we all agree we look lovely in it. I think Professor Perkis still needed to be convinced whether this was a good idea, perhaps. He's quite committed to it in the way the rest of us are, but I think he's on board now. This was just at the lunch when we kind of came up with the idea of this event. So you can see Ronnie is very happy with the idea, and as we all are. So just a nice little memory of when this was conceived, really. A lunch at the,
Couples.
yeah, a lunch go for you can obviously see what's behind us. And yeah, a good moment. So that's why we're here today. Literally, that's why we're here today. So okay, this is a kind of a tappy cat. I would definitely describe paper that I'm going to talk about now. I'm going to present now. I'm talking about biography and writing about Saladin in the medieval period, and I'm also going to talk about writing the modern history of the Crusades, the memory of the Crusades. I'll say a little bit about why we might do that, why we should do that, and you know, sort of what's the point kind of thing. But just to start with, it was quite this comment. Writing biographies hasn't always been hugely popular in academia. To be labelled a biographer marked the doom of one's reputation in the historical profession. Well, maybe it still does. Geoffrey Elton, even at its best, biography is a poor way of writing history. Historians should not suppose that in writing biography is writing history. 1996. Again, this is not these are not green lights here, folks. Not even amber. I mean, I think in a sense, when that last one was being produced, the tide was changing, and it's not really a simple thing as talking about a border here. I think that's an interesting way of putting it. The border separating history of biography has always been uncertain and anything but peaceful. But you can see, in a sense, some of the sort of collections, theoretical discussions of biography 2014, or even just dropping back much further back. There is always a sort of more respectable, should we say, element of biography. Although this is obviously a shorter thing with the ODNB, founded a long time ago by, I think, Virginia Woolf's father. Yeah, in fact, somebody Stevens, Leslie Stevens. Yeah, but in a sense, what are we doing when we're writing a biography of a person? Well, let's go to Rob Bartlett. It's really weird with screens both ways. I don't know which way to look. All right, okay. The primary purpose of a biography is to evoke an individual. Cannot be done without reference to the world that individual inhabited. I think that's a pretty solid definition to work from. Bartlett employed it back in the 80s in his Gerald of Wales biography, which is an excellent book, which I think he has updated since then. So, but just in a sense, I just wanted to get across that some people in the past have been snooty about biographies. I think in a sense, if you tackle it with Bartlett's frame of reference, you're probably heading in the right direction. That's a little bit about what got me into writing the biography of Saladin, and a little bit more about wider writing of history here. One or two of you may have seen this slide before, but the thing that prompted me to write about Saladin was being in Damascus in 2009, when I saw a sign for Saladin the ballet, and Andrew and I went along on the opening night. It was terrible. See, memory. So, okay, memory. There we go. Okay, we're immediately into an issue here. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but we did turn to the woman next to us and said, "How long is this going to last?" About 4 hours. Our faces. So it's only 2.5 is my memory of it in the end. But these lovely lads danced their way to victory over the Crusaders, and by the end of it, everybody was clapping along. This is in the theatre in downtown Damascus, where Assad sort of still makes speeches from. So obviously, very much a sort of government-endorsed production. We were actually there on the opening night, and there'd been various speeches by ministers, obviously denouncing Israel, to bursts of applause, and so in a sense, you know, it was very plain that this was, I say, a government-endorsed production, but also in a sense why it happened. This was Saladin drawing his people together, defeating the drunken Crusaders and expelling the Westerners, square bracket Israel, from Jerusalem, is certainly the way that I took it. And everybody was clapping along. There was no Third Crusade, no 0-0 draw of the Third Crusade. They sort of stopped when they were the going was good, and that was the shape of the production. It has still, I sort of tried to track down what happened to this lot, and they ended up in Qatar, They performed it in Algeria, I think. So in other words, they fled pretty rapidly. But you could see why it was there. And I sort of thought, well, okay, it's pretty obvious, self-evident why the Assad regime was peddling this, so to speak. But it made me think about we are several hundred years later, how Saladin's memory had emerged and survived down the centuries. And that I think also then sort of speaks to well, and I'll say so I wanted to trace that a little bit more. And I also wanted to take on an academic argument, which was Werner Ender's 1984 argument that Saladin was forgotten by the Muslim Near East, which I didn't find terribly convincing, which has then been sort of hardened by people like Carol Hillenbrand, Jonathan Riley-Smith, no disrespect to either of them, and the idea that the Kaiser kindly reminded the Muslim Near East of their great hero on his visit in 1898. Obviously, he's in Jerusalem there on the left, and then put that wreath on top of Saladin's tomb when he went to Damascus, and praised Saladin as being the great hero and somebody who he respected, and as sort of Ender's argument as sort of hardened, and is then repeated in places like Paul Connaughton in How Societies Remember, a book about history and memory, trots out Ender's argument, and so in a sense it has gained a lot of traction, and I just felt he wasn't plausible. Not to put too intellectual upon an approach to it, that he would have been forgotten. So I wanted to track that, to challenge it, but to try and publish a book about it was not possible. Publishers didn't want to just write about that at the time. I had to go and write, they said you must write a history of Saladin's medieval life as well. Okay, well, there's some problems there for me, shall we say, which I'll come across in a minute. But writing about the Crusades in the modern era, I suppose, is something that I've ended up doing quite a bit. I mean, it came into my head, I have to say, after the horror of 9/11, when George W. Bush did say this crusade, this war on terror is going to take a while. I was shaving. I didn't cut myself, but it certainly stopped me. I heard that on the radio one morning, in November, I think it was, when he came out with that remark. And I think as historians of the Crusades, sometimes you've got to justify being a medieval historian to some extent. What's the point? Why are you doing that? And for many of the wrong reasons, I suppose, we actually have we have an explanation, an answer, because crusading is such an enduring idea. I always say to my students, you can go online and search the English newspapers, The Guardian, very left-leaning, the Daily Mail, which is a disgusting newspaper, and I wouldn't urge anybody to look at it under normal circumstances, but it's certainly to the right, should we say. And you do that for the last 10 days and you will find the word crusade in it multiple times, I promise you. Absolutely. The Daily Express, another right-leaning paper, their sort of symbol is a crusader, on the banner, sort of strip at the top. It's there. Lewis Hamilton is on a crusade for another World Formula One championship, crusade for fair play in rugby, crusade for making the economy better, etc., etc. It's just there in endless use in the English language. And I realize it's different in other countries, but it's there. So this is an idea that is, really incredibly durable, flexible, malleable. How have we got to that point? Which is not what I'm going to talk about in some detail today, but in the sense of us slightly justifying our existence as medievalists, or certainly in the British system, this word is here. What does it mean? How did it get here? And then talking about the Muslim Near East, when Bush demonstrated what a toxic word it is, how toxic and powerful that memory is, as it is to other people too. Thinking of Jews, thinking of Greek Orthodox, they certainly haven't forgotten it either. So just placing these different historical legacies and memories in some context. And I think in a sense, it's not our public duty, that's too pompous, but in a sense, it has an element of certainly utility and significance to understand the past. That is our job, I suppose, isn't it? And to use it to help explain the present in this particular circumstance of something that is so powerful dangerous, toxic. You see when politicians use the word, invoke it, do they do it carelessly? Do they do it cynically? Do they do it casually? All of the above. So I think that's part of it. I mean, yeah, and it is pertinent. I have ended up talking to government agencies about it. You know, to MI5, MI6, the Foreign Office, the Security Secretariat, the US State Department, the head of counter-terror, because they want to know what's happening. Because when you have people in their careers moving through these departments, they're not all, sadly, medieval history graduates. And, you know, they're bright people, but why on earth would they know? In a sense, if you see Crusade all the time in an English newspaper, you think it's a very passive, secular thing that's probably a good cause. If you don't start thinking about it at all, or you think of Richard the Lionheart, and it's kind of Robin Hood, and it's chainmail, and it's just so far back, or it's idiots at football matches or cricket matches, for that matter. You know, thinking about those guys that got booted out of the World Cup in Qatar wearing Crusader gear. You know. Yeah. So, you know, but why is that a problem? So I think having a sense of that, you know, being able to explain that, you know, to various people, and then how we all understand it is something that's worthwhile tracking. And as a subject, you know, it's intriguing. And it's got so many different dimensions to it. And I mean, my work on Saladin, some of you have heard bits of it before. I've been starting working recently on Erdogan in Turkey, given how topical he is. And I'll sort of show you some images at the, you know, certainly the last 5 or 6 slides about him and how he is engaged with it. But I'm running ahead there. So that really is a sort of overview. In a sense, I think that's almost a justification of what I'm doing. But going back to the medieval period. Well, in a sense, obviously, I'm a historian from a Western perspective, and writing about the medieval Saladin. I mean, I was very daunted by this. I mean, there's Hannes Mooring's book I should have put on there as well. I don't think I owned a copy of it then, but I do now, and other sort of previous biographies. But I'm as I say, I'm a Western-based historian. I went to Carol Hillenbrand's book launch of her Crusades, Islamic Perspectives in 1999. And somebody came up to me and said, "What are you doing here? You're a Crusader." Okay, thanks. So, you know, which I thought was an interesting kind of approach, that I shouldn't be there because I was a Crusader. So this has obviously given me, look at my body language, I'm pressing my legs here, an enormous imposter syndrome in writing this, and rightly so. But in a sense, when I was looking to write the history of Saladin, there's clearly some obstacles that I faced. First of all, saying something different in the light of these particularly, I suppose, these 3 books. Ehrenkreuz is very powerful. I mean, in the sort of background to the legacy of Saladin down the years, in the English language, influenced by people like Walter Scott, The Talisman, then through Stanley Lane Poole's kind of a very romanticized version of him. Then Ehrenkreuz, which is this sort of powerful counterblast, saying really Saladin is an utterly cynical, very bad man. His son wrote to me after my book came out and said, "I saw that, you know, you'd mentioned my dad's book," and he told me a bit about why his father was so sort of negative about Saladin, and justifying his sort of stance on him, that he I suppose didn't want people to be taken in by somebody who was so persuasive. Lions of Jackson, of course, is a wonderful book. We've heard Malcolm Lyon's name referenced already this morning. A very dense book indeed, not for the faint-hearted. I think there's about 2 dates in the entire thing, but it's wonderful. Then Anne-Marie Ede's tremendous book, very wide-ranging, lightish on narrative, great on the themes, great on the writing of the history of Saladin. I'm not sure I wholly, or the sources, to the point where I think she very much regards them very considerably as literary creations, and leans heavily in that direction. I suppose I didn't turn quite that far. So I had the sort of challenge of like saying something different. I'm a historian of the Crusades. Language, Arabic, I don't have it. So there's the imposter syndrome creeping in considerably. So I have to, so I'm sorry, Benny, first first Kedar rule broken here. Translation. I suppose I think as somebody who teaches the Crusades, one of the big things that's changed over the last 25 years is the fact that there are Donald Richards, I think, and particularly for bringing, for example, those main translations of things like Ibn al-Athir and Ibn Shaddad to general usage, if you see what I mean, in schools and classrooms and universities. So, you know, they are regarded, so I'm told, as excellent translations. There's increasingly more material around as I'll demonstrate. I suppose I had to get used to different forms of source material. Reuven, you know, brilliantly showed us some of those today, and I'm going to talk about some of them in these documents that I'm going to talk about. Thinking about the past in the modern sense, memory theory, that wasn't something that maybe shamefully I hadn't grasped or engaged with considerably. Some of my students now know is a happy part of the MA class, and it's all good fun, starting with compulsory viewings of Rashomon for all concerned. But Paul Cobb is responsible for that. And different historical periods. I'm a 12th, 13th century historian. I ended up having to learn, you know, engaging with the 19th, 20th century, as I'll describe a little bit, and to learn about them. And you might say, so what? Some of the, you know, we all have to do that to some extent when we're starting our research. And yes, that is true. But if you're looking, if you're writing a biography, in a sense, you've kind of walked into another difficulty, because if you choose your area of research, Venice or you know, Baibars or something, then you have control to some extent about what you're looking at. Well, with a biography, you've got to follow Bartlett's kind of frame. You've got to try and look at everything, which takes you into areas that you are less familiar with. And I have to say, you've got to be positive about that. I mean, I found it so, I learned so much about so many things researching this book. It forced me so far out of my comfort zone in so many different ways of chronology, source material, that and I've said this before, I sat there smiling writing it, I kid you not. It was just so exciting and interesting to learn about 19th century Egyptian drama. Who knew that was an exciting topic? But it is actually. and things like that, on newspapers, the development of newspapers. And so you've got to, in a sense, engage with some background reading to get yourself off the mark. But, and it's terrifying because you are wandering into an area where, of course, you don't know much about, but it's exciting. So I suppose what I'm saying is, when you write a biography, if you take one on, you know, you've got to be prepared for what you're letting yourself in for. But the excitement and the putting yourself out of your comfort zone is considerable. So that is worth doing so. Now, when I started sort of looking at trying to write about Saladin in the medieval time, obviously you can look at those narratives. I've got a slightly different take than Anne-Marie on things like Ibn Shaddad, and I think he is critical at times of Saladin. I don't think that's terribly brought out. You can look at Western sources, his William of Tyre. You can look at other sort of accessible narratives like Ibn Jubayr and things like that. But bringing in another one of Benny's pieces of advice is cooperation. And I was incredibly lucky. So in a sense, my sort of echoing Benny's point is just ask people. Most academics are just delighted that you might actually be interested in what they're doing. and most of them want to help you. You can't say all of them do, but most of them do. And we can all think of somebody who won't. But I didn't mean any individual there. I'm not being personal here, okay? But I meant that broadly. And I was very, very lucky. I was sort of right time, right place. And this wonderful project, which I'm going to draw upon a little bit, Ibn Abi Usaybiyah, or Son of Little Pinky, as Emily Savage Smith insisted I call him. That was the only condition of me using her material pre-publication, is that I actually wrote that in the book, because she said her colleagues wouldn't allow her to use it anywhere else. And so this is this enormous project. This is free online. people know I have an uneasy relationship with technology, and I was going to put a link up and go into it, but I just thought the scope for sniggering from people behind me is too considerable, and me making a fool of myself. But you can simply find that it's open access Brill Online, and as far as people looking to write and research the history of the Near East, I think this is one of the huge game changers. This text, I think. This is a man who wrote, it's called A Literary History of Medicine, and it's one in a sense like these dictionary that Ruben was talking about. And so if you want to have a look at a little extract that I've got here for you, it's about Al-Jilani, who Anne was talking about. So it's the kind of one, I think, rather than the printed one. And what Ibn Abi Yusuf did, he died in 1270. He wrote most of this in Sarkad, but he born in Damascus, lived in Cairo, and he wrote. So he's writing under a Mamluk, Ayyubid Mamluk sort of crossover. He wrote 442 entries of the best medics or famous medics, and this whole thing has been produced in this wonderful free online edition by Emily Savage Smith and a number of colleagues. And why I was lucky is that she gave me most of it before it was only sort of published last year. She was giving this to me pre-publication once she decided I was possibly trustworthy, and I'd struck the little pinky deal with her. So in a sense, I was just extraordinarily fortunate to do that. But then what you can do with these texts, because I suppose if you're trying to say something different about Saladin, I suppose I wanted to get away from the narrative. I didn't want to just talk about, battles and politics and things. And I have to say, as somebody who teaches this stuff, once you start going down the road of looking at this sort of text, because it's not simply a list of doctors, what this has got in it is anecdotes. It's got huge amounts of poetry. And again, as a historian from a crusading background, poetry, so sure about that. The French removed most of it from the Recueil, from the Arabic text in the 19th century, because poetry is for sort of blokes with long blonde hair, sort of sat by a river in Oxford kind of thing. It doesn't tell you what happened, does it? Well, no, it doesn't, but it tells you what people are interested in and what people value. And the importance of poetry in Arab culture was something that was, all right, being blunt, was news to me. In the one sense that Osman Latif, who again, I was delighted to see my former student's book was mentioned the other day. He did a thesis on jihad poetry. So I suppose I thought naively, maybe I shouldn't say this here, a lot of that's all the sort of poetry that there was, or most of it. And of course, you look here, and the poetry that is political, it's romantic, it's funny, it's about drinking games, it's pornographic, it's satirical, it's entertaining. There is jihad poetry. And there's also sort of poetry of encouragement here. And Al-Jilani, I've just really pulled out little extracts. I'll just make a couple of comments when I go through it with you. It's poetry and patronage. And in the case of Saladin, you've got a man who loves poetry and who loves poetry competitions. And so, in a sense, one could begin to construct, I'm not going to go too far down this road, something about court life, cultural life in the Ayyubid Near East. And it's a project that maybe Carol Hillenbrand and I would like to get going, a broader cultural history of the Ayyubid Near East. But that's for another time. But I'm saying these texts, if you're looking to teach away from the political narrative, the richness of this material is just staggering. And if you're looking for sort of social, cultural, economic material, it's there. I also mentioned Al-Jilani, not least because I mentioned, but this is if you look at the text that I put in front of you, you can see again, you appreciate how multi-talented these people are. He's a literature, medicine, ophthalmology. Most of them are multi-talented, shall we say, and of course composes poetry as a good adab person would. He's from Andalusia, and towards the bottom of the first section, he composed figurative poems, and these are they. Again, if you haven't come across these are poems.
What was the one before?
It's Al-Jilani. No, hang on, no, it's not, is it? No, it is, yeah.
Table of contents? Not a table of contents?
No, I don't know if it's table of contents, but it's one of his works. And this is on the right is his 2.5, the one is 2.5 meters. And Julia Bray, I think she stood on a table. Were you there? No? The one in St Andrew? No. She stood on a table to demonstrate how big this thing was. And the one on the right, the fan-shaped one. So that it's a performative piece as well. So those, I mean, that's a nice sort of cross-reference to it. But then you move through this text, and I mean, there's dozens of others as well. You move through this text and you can see what's going on in the text. And towards the section of 15:11:2, he sends a poem to Saladin to encourage him, just to say, you know, keep going, old chap. Sorry, that's a preaching sermons. And he says what this is called. And you go down the bottom of the first page, he mentions Yusuf, Saladin's given name. You can read this yourselves and pick bits out. On the third page, I've just put those little bits in. So this is broken up. The poem is like about 9 pages long. And I thought the patience with your colleagues photocopying may not stand it. But I just thought the bit on the third page talking about the mound outside Acre, which we drove past yesterday. So there's a reference there. They advanced to the mound of Acre, their hive tightly packed swooped down from it. So just a sort of sense of this man who is at, you know, he sees Saladin struggling at the siege of Acre. He sees Saladin being ill at the siege of Acre, and sends this sort of encouraging poem, which of course, you know, is part of the sponsorship that he gets there. And then at the bottom is a list of the other things that he wrote that Ibn Abi Yusuf is aware of. So again, look at the range of things that you've got there to draw upon. And there are many other entries here, many other stories about people's health, incidents, moments, behavior. Saladin's upset that somebody else who is in his entourage has a red tent. Only Saladin's allowed a red tent, so he gets it taken down, and the man has a sulk, and so he has to reward him with a nice concubine and things like that. And this man's rather ill-mannered, and he has to sort of polish up his manners and things like that. This is all sort of, I think, gets you away from the sort of core narratives, and is in a sense of how a sort of more cultural court history that's there. So I was sort of very fortunate, and that's it. Julia Bray gave me translations of some of the other bits of the poetry. As I say, Emily Savage-Smith and some of her colleagues let me see that whole thing beforehand. But it is free online, so you can do it. Or you could buy, I think it's 4 large volumes from Brill if you fancy backgrounding yourself. Another one of these biographical dictionaries that I enjoyed engaging with is Ibn Khalakhan, who died in 1282. So again, under Reuven's auspices. And again, we haven't got the time to go through this, but I think it's an interesting text. You can see how he's writing. He is quoting in the way that Reuven was showing people talking about, you know, the different historical texts that people have milked, shall we say. If you look on the second page, you can see him making reference to page 536. You can see him talking about Imad ad-Din al-Asfahani, Baha'u'd Din ibn Shaddad. So he sort of gives away some of his source material here. But he also talks, by the time we get to the later pages, of the bottom of page 541. This is a rather Western sounding thing. I should only add that all of which I've stated my own ocular testimony to support it. And I've avoided exaggeration, but they all say that, don't they? But he does also point out that his family's in the pay of this man. But I use this because, in a sense, again, these biographical dictionaries, I think as a Western scholar, we're not used to dealing with them, certainly on this scale. And again, you read this about Kekburi, who obviously this man knows quite well, and it's an astonishing ceremony that he describes, celebrating the prophet's birthday with this feasting, these processions. It's such a vivid evocation And a sense I was interested in, because it's not Saladin, because you just think, oh, you know, is it just the boss can do this stuff and has the resources or the interest? You might speculate other people do it, but this is, you know, Kickbury is an important figure. But I thought it was interesting to see somebody out from the sort of super spotlight, engaging in this. And again, at a local level, the geography, the topography that he's working with in the hippodrome and all that kind of stuff. I just think they're really exciting, vivid materials that once you start moving through these texts, it's worth engaging in. So sorry, that's even Calicut. Yeah, it is a 19th century translation. I should have, when I mentioned Osman, when I said I didn't have Arabic, I always say I have Osman though. Because if there was things in Arabic that I knew existed, for example, bits of Ibn ad-Din al-Isfahani that were not in the Massey translation into French, I could track those down and give those to Osman, and a lot of modern stuff as well I presented to him, and he kindly produced. Although thinking of translations, I mean, he did say, I'm not sure the complexities of some of these writings. He said, I can translate this 3 ways and they're all right. With someone like Ibn ad-Din al-Isfahani, because it is so complicated, convoluted, and in a sense it was sort of which one do you want? So there is that. Some other texts that I, again, slightly off the beaten track, thinking about Saladin, when he took control of Egypt, he asked for a book of etiquette to be written, which I thought was an interesting approach in a sense of explaining his success. I think when you take over a country as an outsider, you know, he's a Kurd in a Sunni Syrian invasion force from an equestrian society, and he ends up ruling Egypt in early 1169, which is a very different country. Egypt is ruled by the Nile, of course. But as a conqueror, you know, you can take different approaches. You can just try and steamroller your own sort of regime on top of it. But if you're such an outsider as Saladin, you've got to do something different and maybe weave your way into the society. The complexities of the Sunni Syrian sort of splits and overlaps and sort of bleeding into one another that is late Fatimid Egypt. But to ask for a book of etiquette, I thought was interesting. He also asked for something that's effectively a doomsday book of Egypt, which again I found an interesting text to find and then to grapple with. He wants to know how much money he's got to give away. William Tard talks about generosity being Saladin's greatest weapon. Well, if you've got the wealthiest country in the Near East at your disposal, that's all very well, but he wants to know exactly how much money he's got to give away. And this thing describes things practically to the number of seeds that I'll give you, the number of trees that you have. It's a very rich text, the name of which escapes me this very second, but it's there. But also, again, thinking of, which again, I say economic history is not my thing remotely, and it never will be. But I found this particular, you know, I had a reason to want to look at this text and find it and to use it. And so I engaged with it. I suppose things like ritual and ceremony as well. He processes through Egypt for the ceremony of the cutting of the canals and the rising of the Nile, the measuring of the Nilometer. And here it is, and the ceremony where a local official hangs from this thing in the Nilometer and is perfumed by the ruler. Well, the Fatimids did it, and Saladin immediately clocks into it. In fact, there's a bit in Ibn ad-Din al-Isfahani that I got Osman to translate. Saladin's up in Syria, and somebody writes to him saying, the man who measures the Nile has died. Why is that important? Well, it is clearly important enough that somebody's written to tell him. Do you know what I mean? So that sort of throws in maybe how important this kind of ceremony was to him. But he processes through it again, an astonishingly visual, engaging, powerful ceremony that I found fascinating to learn about, but also in a sense of showing, for me writing about him, that he engages with the local way of doing things immediately and wants to work with the grain when he possibly can. So other things, more material culture, literally, with robes of honor. You cannot read a text about Saladin without seeing the words robes of honor, to the point, you know, God, you know, this is ridiculous. How many of these has he got? And they are being produced literally on an industrial scale in Fatimid, Egypt. There are factories making them. So this is, I mean, of course, it's in part his personality and the way he operates. But again, trying to work with that as a something that was sort of forced upon me, if you like. If you keep seeing this phrase "robes of honor" in the text, well, what are they? What are they made of? How do they work? Have we got any? Etc. etc. So biography writing can be a positive experience, is what I'm rambling towards saying, and that's certainly one that stretches you. Also, I mean, there we were yesterday. I suppose the siege of Acre forced me to think in other things about medicine again. So using Ibn Abi Sabir, I'm not a military historian per se, but I've got much more interested in aspects of the siege of Acre, the great Frankish ditch that they constructed somehow, and the politics of Saladin trying to hold his fragile confederation of the Near East together was all part of learning about him. But then obviously we have, you know who on the left, who's found his way to the Globe Theatre somehow, ambling onto the scene. And so there's, I suppose, also writing biographies, you have to deal with things that are then very familiar, perhaps to you as a historian or to people, that sometimes, you know, I suppose maybe are less exciting to write about. But so in a sense, again, you have no choice. You've got to engage with these. So this is the sort of medieval writings about Saladin, and there's his tomb in Damascus, sat there. Then moving down the centuries, I suppose I wanted to try to tackle how his memory had survived down the centuries, and that involved really exploring as many different texts as I could discover, looking at jihad treaties, travel documents, geographical descriptions. There is written in 1520 a history of the Franks, the accursed Frankish invaders, a small and fairly unknown text, which again I got Osmond to translate bits of for me, and really sort of working with some Ottoman text as well. Ruben, in you know, you were saying about worries of crusaders down the centuries. There are moments. The Order of San Stefano is created, and that is a 16th century creation, I think. They've got a fantastic couple of buildings in Pisa where their headquarters are, with sort of should we say victory mementos from various battles, and a spectacularly decorated hall just in Pisa. And again, when they look as if they're turning up, there's references in the local text to, we think this is happening again. You know, there's the looking back to the medieval period, which again also in a sense, if we're thinking about the memory of the Crusades, is clear, obvious. Oh, here they come again. We haven't seen this since the time of Saladin, etc., etc. But also other bits of evidence like that poem that we published in Crusades in Jerusalem in the early 17th century, wasn't it? Yeah. For example.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
What are we seeing here? Is the tomb is inside the box, and what is the part that's covered with cloth?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Not untypical.
Yes.
It's not untypical. It's just been fixed up. I mean, the glass is obviously to protect it, and the cloth is obviously to protect it. You'll see that also in modern tombs. But and green was a color associated with other things with these tombs. But that's classic in a sense. I mean, we could get rid of the glass and get rid of the wood frame and get rid of all the cloth. You would see, and there'd probably be, you know, what's underneath that round thing at the top is probably his headdress, or not the physical headdress, but what was some addition of his headdress.
Yeah, thank you.
And it also could be a little bit later, not necessarily what was built in right after his death.
No, that is constructed, I think, a decade. It's a few years after his death. He ends up in there.
But besides that, I mean, maybe it will be in the 16th century. I don't know, but that they added the top, that top triangle.
But in the sense of looking at his memory down the century, sorry, this is I was going to say, well, first of all, you can do it in the West. Sorry, I've sidetracked myself with another picture from the globe here, but it's quite fun. You were talking about the True Cross yesterday, William. Well, there it is, clearly, or not. But so in the sense it's looking at his memory in the West, but say more concerned with the Near East. So you look at travelers' documents, Ottoman documents, Naima, who writes, for example, books of history are overflowing with stories about Saladin, which was probably my favorite line that I found of anything. Books of history are overflowing. So many I don't need to tell you.
Not supposed to be Saladin. It's supposed to be better than the West.
No, I think it's is it Naima? No, Salibi, traveler. It is, it's Salibi. Then of course you get to the late 18th, early 19th century and Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, and suddenly the source material starts jumping up far more. We're obviously 100 years before the Kaiser still, Kaiser Wilhelm, and Napoleon's presence and invasion brings the memory of the Crusades back strongly. Nicholas the Turk writes, oh, the French, well, we didn't like them the first time, didn't like their clothes, didn't like their language, and we captured their king. Of course, he's gone straight back to Mansoura, and that line back again, I thought was very instructive that he's writing around 1800, he's straight back to 1250. When you then start moving through the 19th century, you've got much more material and technology changes, and this is where I had to sort of learn about things like printing, newspapers, novels, all sorts of sort of broader cultural changes and dynamics as theatre emerged in Egypt, for example, using a lot of Western plays. Things like Scott and Dumas were put on the stage in Cairo, and some of them are modified versions of that, and some of them are home written productions. And obviously in Cairo, with the British taking control in the 1880s, there's a sort of sharper edge to some of these productions, which occasionally get banned. And so you've got all sorts of interesting things to work with and from. But the material base for me as a medieval historian, of course, suddenly got so much wider with newspapers, plays, novels, you can see here, etc., etc. It also merges into nationalism. This is issue number 1 of the Daily Kurd, apparently, 1913. And of course, who are you going to put on the cover? That's the image that's in a frame above Saladin's tomb in Damascus. It's clearly an image that image reappears a lot, and so it's there. 1913 clearly being portrayed. Education, there's some good studies of Turkish schools and schools curricula being written from the 19th, concerning material in the 19th century. So again, you delve into that. Of course, another great way of discovering how popular attitudes are there, because in a sense, you can then start looking at how popular attitudes develop across through using things such as newspapers and school curriculum and things like that. This is from Jerusalem. This is from the religious house, the French religious house by St. Anne's, where the Saladin University was, 1915 to 1917. The Ottomans setting that kind of thing up. So again, it's moving into a different sphere, a much sharper political thing going on here with the emergence of Zionism and Saladin being brought into play there. Or things like in Syria, 1919. These are materials in the National Archives. The British summarized Arab newspapers every week for people like me. And the attitudes that they, again, look to, this is in November 1919, that they're bringing out. They also invoke, is it Trieste, the man who made Trieste a free place in 1919? Forgotten his name. It's interesting, a very contemporary reference to that. The British government official wrote, the author of this is as dangerous as he is clever, was the official's comment in ink at the side. Next. In other words, didn't really engage with it. Arab nationalism provides a huge swathe of material. I don't want to go into this in too much detail. You can see Nasser, you can see Sadat over his right shoulder, actually. There, of course, the United Arab Republic. I don't want to give you all of this modern history lesson here. This is probably much more familiar, but obviously they're at Saladin's tomb there. As I always say, if you've never seen this, 2.5 hours of your time would be very well spent watching this. If you want to understand Arab nationalism, it's a party political broadcast, basically.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the Shaheen, Al Nasser Saladin, which is it's a interesting piece of cinema, if you like, 1960s cinema with split screens and things like that. And it is subtitled. A lot of shouting, a lot of battles, a lot of fake blood, a lot of bad prosthetics. But
You can get it off the.
it is on. It is on.
YouTube.
No, it's on Netflix.
It's on Netflix as well, yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, Saladin is invoked considerably. With this is Assad Senior, as it were, with the Battle of Hattin. Again, that's apparently there's a huge image of this in his office, and he used to lecture people like Kissinger and Jimmy Carter that this is what happened last time. This is what's going to happen again. But you can see again, but this I think was Carol Hillenbrand got me this. Gave me this image. It's from a sort of newspaper handout. So again, if you're thinking about how things are being transmitted across the sort of wide, it's a free throwaway thing in a newspaper. Images being perpetuated at a sort of deeper cultural level. This is this quite well-known statue in Damascus of Saladin, put up in the early 1990s outside the Citadel. Again, a strong public sort of powerful representation with the defeated Crusaders there on the right-hand side, looking as if they're facing their doom. Saddam Hussein, the ironies of Saladin and the Kurds not lost on anybody except him, of course. And again, just to keep William happy, this is a bath mat, I think, or something like that, as another piece of evidence, though. You've got there a big public, well, I'm not sure what it's made of, to be quite honest. It looks a bit like fiberglass, but not for me to say.
Who created that? Arabic?
Yes, I know the name. Carol Hillenbrand met him, and there's a picture of him in her book. But that's a big public monument that presumably cost a bit of money. The name, there's a nice little picture of him. He's got his bow tie on. He looks very proud of it himself next to it in Carol's book. And that's mass-produced tat. And that's the point. Yeah, you don't need you're getting beyond big public statements. If you're looking at sort of cultural penetration of an idea or an image, if you're churning out something in the Baghdad market that's got that, and of course we're then in the realm of postage stamps, banknotes.
Is it, Jonathan, is it the same image that features on those stamps and so on? Like, is that
No, there's different ones. Definitely not the same image. Variant, not much different, but it's not one image that's being shown out. You see what I mean? Obviously, Kurds engage with its coinage, but I wanted to finish with Turkey and Saladin and memory of the Crusades, because this is something I suppose I was able to look at when I was doing the book. Egypt quite a bit and a bit about Syria. Turkey less so, not least because I don't have the language. But more recently, I have an MA student who does, and it's been very helpful in looking at this. And interesting, I was teaching the MA class about Gallipoli. We had an image of Gallipoli and Australian soldiers depicting themselves as crusaders. And there is, in fact, a poem written by the man who wrote the lyrics to the Turkish national anthem. He's an important poet at the time, invoking Saladin. So you've got that parallel, interesting parallel at Gallipoli of the Anzacs as crusaders and the Turks with Saladin going yes. There's quite a lot more I think can be done sort of down the centuries, but this is just by way of fun. This is on the internet. It's 1970. Saladin does kung fu. It's filmed on a beach. I think it cost a couple of quid to make, but he is the main man actor of the day, apparently, and where you can see where it's going from the picture, can't you? I haven't. I probably just haven't been bothered to watch it yet, but I think I probably should. I have seen clips of it, and there are men running around on a beach. Again, I'm sure you can find and enjoy at your leisure. But I think this is you know, again, cultural. But more recently, and more interestingly, Erdogan, who I suppose 2014-15 started pivoting away from the West, you know, thinking about joining the EU and things like that, disappeared. And he obviously has his reasons for doing this. And you know, don't know enough about PIR, but clearly his relationship with the Kurds is going to be a complicated and an awkward one, and I'm willing to be corrected on any or all of this. But as part of it, he has been engaging with, if you like, the legacy of Saladin and looking to use that. And so down in the southeast of the country, you have this airport, the new Saladin airport being opened, and you start looking at the cities in the southeast, and you can see the number of Saladin parks, hospitals, and I'll come to one more in a minute. So it's clearly something he's looking to tap into, but more maybe alarmingly, in Istanbul, there is set up this institute. And so once a year, this group have been meeting, and there's like a Kurdish Islamist element. They had a Hamas spokesman there a couple of years ago. Erdogan sends messaging to be read out along to this thing. So and they have a website which you know, the first year was extraordinarily sort of incendiary stuff. They seem to, by the fourth year, they seem to be now talking about Saladin as an educator, and they sort of, whether it's being reined back. I know not enough about the politics of Turkey to know why the Kurdish Islamist group have, I mean, there's clearly all sorts of other local or national politics going on in it. But in a sense of drawing your attention to the existence of this, and this kind of his I suppose currency, which, you know, taking me back to why the memory and the legacy of the Crusades is important, worth knowing about, worth understanding. What are they tapping into here? Obviously very selectively, you know, going without saying, you look at memory theory, you use the past for presentist purposes, and you pick what you like. You leave out the inconvenient bits, but there's some clear bits to put in there. Now I love this. This is not, there's much humor in this situation, but this is definitely cause for. I suspect this is photoshopped, but
It looks like from Kingdom of Heaven.
yeah, and okay, at the start of the pandemic, the Brits were completely hopelessly unprepared, as we all know, thanks to our leader. And you know, the amount of sort of personal protection stuff was there, and Turkey had a lot of it and sent some over to Britain. And this is a newspaper that's from Konya, so a very religious city. And it's sort of said that the West, who you know only exports violence and weapons, has thanked Turkey, Pope Francis and the World Health Authority and the English Defence Minister Ben Wallace, that important international statesman, have thanked Erdogan and Turkey for giving us this personal protection stuff. And Erdogan, in doing so, is just like Saladin, because he, in the course of the Third Crusade, when they were unwell, sent them fresh fruit. During the siege, and when Richard's horse was taken under him, he sent him a horse. So Erdogan helps the West, like Saladin helped the West. There you go. More recently, again, this is last month, in April, 2 months ago. So Diyarbakir, earthquake area, and look at the size of that. You know, this is a vastly expensive building, and it's the new Salahattin Ayyubi Mosque. They're opened by Erdogan. So he's clearly, you know, these titles in that particular area, that the currency is strong, shall we say. So kind of, I'm not sure how to draw things to a close. I suppose I was using the Erdogan stuff to demonstrate that in parts this is quite sort of almost live research. It can go in all sorts of different directions. It all started from writing a biography. Didn't know where it was. I had no idea where it was going to take me. It's taken me in so many different places that I guess that I've enjoyed it. But just in a sense of, don't be afraid of doing different things. It is quite worrying. Ask people for help. They are almost certainly just happy to assist you and offer their advice. As I say, they'll be pleased that somebody's interested in what they do. And then in a sense, with the memory of the Crusades in the West and the Near East, you have the ability to communicate it. You're able to comment on it with caveats that maybe I know nothing about the serious politics of Turkey, but you have a starting point to get into it. Thank you.
Right, we can turn on the lights. Actually. I'll show you that. Oh, wow. Thank you so much for showing us that history can be really fun.
Yeah.
And and connect to the present in ways that I never thought it could connect. I didn't know anything about Erdogan at all. So thanks so much. And I see there are a few. Yeah, did you? No. Okay. Any students?
Yeah, question. I'm not sure I understand it correctly, but there is look back in the modern period, there is more using inside in memories. That's because like more sausage, or because it's like the nationalism and everything, like he became like more important.
It's a bit of both, I think. You know, if you thinking of there is more evidence available for sure, literally more of it. But if you think of somebody who was like Ibn al-Athir, excuse me, and think of things like Conrad Hirschler's work on tracking those texts through, you know, he will show that things like Ibn al-Athir are copied multiple times down the century, excuse me, and can demonstrate the way that these sources are the ones that Reuben writes about al-Makrizi, who is taking chunks of Ibn al-Athir and Ibn Shaddad thing. And so there's in a sense the sort of there is a volume there, but how easy it is to, you know, it's much easier for me to find stuff on drama in Egypt in the 19th century, and obviously newspapers simply generate volume. But then when things like Ibn al-Athir are put into print, the 1860s, that in a sense tells you something. Thank you. Tells you something that people think it's worth doing. Abu Sharma's The Two Gardens is serialized by a Lebanese newspaper in 1860, one of the first newspapers produced in the Lebanon. Why do newspaper proprietors serialize things they think their readers are interested in? So that is the sort of, yeah, sure, it's an uptake in volume of evidence, but it shows that evidence, the fact that the newspaper proprietor thinks Abu Sharma is, he must have read it, he thinks it's interesting, he thinks it's going to be what his readers want, is that. There's also, in a sense, yes, once you get to the 19th century, or I'd say 1798, there is more, the Westerners are coming into Mediterranean so much more. You see that, those of you who live in Jerusalem are familiar with it in so many different ways. Things like the St. Louis Hospital, some of the decoration in the Austrian hospice, for example, those mosaics, on the horizon with the, the Kaiser's towers,
Augusta Victoria.
Yeah, Augusta Victoria,
Very good example.
etc. The mosaics in there, if you haven't seen them, with, I think I always joke that Christ was a bit of an afterthought behind the Kaiser, and the mosaics of the kings of Jerusalem that are in there as well. So there's actually a letter to the ambassador in
the PLR.
Yes, there's a letter to the French ambassador in Istanbul saying you've got to stop these French people coming over here and dressing up as crusaders. They are dressing up as crusaders and walking through Jerusalem, and it's really causing me some problems here. But of course, they're very rich people coming over who he's kind of got to keep sweet. So, it's an embarrassment. But again, okay, so that's the West kind of representing themselves as crusaders, looking back to their heritage. But equally then, you can see that what I would say is sort of dry tinder from the centuries gone by, of references to Saladin and the Crusades that survived through the centuries, that is coming from the Near Eastern side as well. So I think it goes both ways. It comes from both directions. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was interested. Did you get reactions to your book from the Islamic world?
There will be a Turkish translation. Not much yet. I think there may be an Urdu translation as well, which is going to be interesting. I gave a paper in India. Spoke at a literary festival in India that was positively received. The people who want to translate it in Turkey are very sort of Western leaning, should we say. So yeah, I would be quite intrigued as to what the response is there. The Turks, so I know who've read it, and some of the people I've had some positive reaction, but I think it's mainly from sort of academics in that area. A couple of emails, possibly somewhere like Malaysia or somewhere like that, but nothing sort of profound. One sort of slight invitation. There's a big Turkish Pakistani production series on Saladin. I think episode 1 has come out, and they did ask me to sort of be a sort of advisor or sort of speak on the opening of it, and I spoke to the producers, some of whom in America. They're all in cars, being very important, on phones, driving around, and I just couldn't bring myself to say, I'm a cheap tart, and I'll do anything for money practically, involved with Saladin, but I just couldn't say the stuff. I didn't give the answers they wanted, let's put it like that. So no further calls. They said that they wanted. They had, they wanted Saladin to be. I think they wanted him to be the peacemaker. It was that was the approach. He is universally good, kind, charming Rainbow Nation Saladin, and not quite like that. And so I just, so that is I suppose was a reaction, but I couldn't.
Right, Brennan. Yeah.
Hi, John. Oh, hi.
So obviously, like, Saladin's been co-opted by a lot of different family groups, and some of which are very anti-Kurdish. So I'm just kind of curious, like, how do the Kurds feel about that, given the fact that Saladin's kind of their guy? Like, do you have anything?
Saladin's everybody's guy, except, well, obviously not perhaps for the Shia. But although again, occasionally he's referenced with Hezbollah, very occasionally that is true. That's the point about Saladin. And I suppose historical memory. You take the bits that you want. You draw upon the bits that you like. Saladin can be a Turk, he can be a Kurd, he can be an Arab. Any or all of the above, depending on what you want him to be. And yes, of course, he's a symbol to the Kurds. It's the Saladin University in Erbil. He's on coinage, etc., etc. I did see some Kurds in Sweden were angry he hadn't set up a Kurdish state in the 12th century.
No.
Can't do everything, can you?
They didn't think understood.
I know that's that's why I was being flippant. Yeah, of course, silly man. I mean, Saladin, silly man. Naughty boy, not thinking of a setting up a Kurdish state. His number one priority in the 12th century. But so in a sense, but it was interesting the way that this woman was angry with him for not doing that, because of course she was thinking of him, in a modern way. He was successful, he was powerful, he could have or should have, shouldn't he? So yeah, I don't know enough about the Turkish, because yes, the tensions are screaming, aren't they? With Erdogan and I don't know enough about Erdogan and the Kurds to begin to go down that road. You really need somebody who's an expert on the politics of modern Turkey to begin to untangle how he seems to sort of, treat them, shall we say, not so well from time to time, but then also want their votes. So it's tricky.
Can I just ask a quick follow on to that, really? Because it occurs when you're showing these various different examples, as you say, there's like people pick and choose which bits of the Saladin past they want to stake claim to. And I was thinking about, parallels with things I'm much more familiar with, the legend of Charlemagne in the Middle Ages. And there, a feature of it is competitive claims. So so my question is, do you ever get a sense of competition between different claims, or people saying, they're not, or he's not the real Saladin, we're the real Saladin, or I'm the real Saladin. In terms
Yeah.
of different kind of, you know,
It's funny because you've got, I suppose, if you think of Syria and Iraq, you've got two Ba'athist leaders. You had two sort of Ba'athist party leaders in Saddam and Assad, both, you know, grabbing Saladin. And I've not heard anybody else. I mean, again, I happily stand corrected of sort of, while they're embracing him, saying, "But he's ours and not yours," kind of thing. Is that what you mean?
well, yeah, kind of what I mean.
We're the ones who can have Saladin. You shouldn't.
Look, I mean, just thinking about, you know, what you've shown us about Turkey and so on, and what's the, to what extent does the uptick in Saladin discourse in Turkey reflect other ways in which other Islamist groups like the Islamic State were laying claim to a, you know, or you know, identifying the West as crusaders, and you know, that, I mean, is there any kind of correlation between the way in which some groups are or individuals are
They sort of cross-fertilizing.
cross-fertilizing, or is Erdogan making a play for the crusading past or the counter-crusading past in response to or to supersede claims that are being made elsewhere?
I don't know enough about that. He just seems to have turned away from the West and towards a much more religious facing group. And if you're looking to antagonize and defeat the West, then you know Saladin is a figure that you can use. Who's also, sorry, one thing I should have said in the course of it, looking at his memory in the Near East down the centuries, he's not always taken as this bloke who defeats the West. He's a good ruler. I think that's, you know, if people say, why isn't, you know, the memory of Baibars is the other obvious, figure from the past to use, and all these stories about Baibars, the Song of Baibars, and we hear about these sort of multiple street performers of that in Aleppo in the early 18th century and things like that. But I sometimes think that, and there is no sort of Song of Saladin kind of equivalent as far as I'm aware. But I suppose part of me thinks that, you know, Baibars is, okay, he's much more efficient at getting rid of crusaders if you want, but he's kind of a bit of a sociopath as well. He strikes me as he strikes me. Sorry. Yeah. He strikes me as a rather less attractive ruler in many respects, and Saladin is okay in part perhaps because of the material that we have about him. So then you're running into the hang on, isn't Ibn Shaddad a mirror for princes, etc., etc. Oh, sorry, that's what I meant to say about the Kekburi thing in here. You read this and it's a mirror. The first bit of it, you know, she said the other day, it's a mirror for princes. It's like he's citing Ibn Shaddad, and you think he's really either that tells you that he's swallowed Ibn Shaddad and is replicating the sort of literary form of it. It also probably tells you how important Mirror for Princes is as a literary genre in the Near East at the time. But that's by the by. So sorry, 2 seconds. Just that I think Saladin is an easier, more attractive, just, merciful, or the image of Saladin, sorry. He's merciful, he's just, he's generous, he's pious, and he wins. So he's kind of got a broader palette of attractive features.
That's what's called
Although
do well and do good and do well.
Although the case for
I'll just note if I can.
Yeah, so I have you and then Anna. And
yeah.
There's a lot that I wrote down to say 2 or 3 things. First of all, we have to remember Saladin had a pretty unremarkable early career.
Yeah.
I mean, he did gain control of Egypt, and then what? And it took him. He spent most of his time fighting other Muslims, and he didn't have great success fighting the Franks overall until Hattin. Hattin was and subsequent victories. So that's interesting, and it was not unnoticed by some of his contemporaries. And I think it's also important to mention that Ibn al-Athir is critical to a degree. He had his detractors.
He has a lot of detractors,
and that brings us back to the modern historiography. And
can I? Okay. All right.
Give me another second. Okay. That but way back when, again in the early 1980s, when I'm just and I read Gibbs' biography, which you didn't mention, and even at the time I thought, Saladin's mother couldn't have written a more more. And then I read Aaron Kreutz. And,
He was also
and I've never gotten free of Aaron Kreutz's, I have to say, Aaron Kreutz's influence has been really fundamental. And then, of course, I've read a lot and since then, but I tend to be a little demeaning of some, personally, I tend to feel that he's overrated. And he had good PR, and he has good PR
He
now.
got brilliant PR.
And so that's something that one should mention, that it's not at all cut from one cloth.
Okay, my response to that would be, yeah, one of the reasons he succeeds is he's got good PR. He'd be all over modern social media. The people around him, and he picks them carefully, are brilliant at letter writing and churning it out, saying what a good job he's doing. In fact, this poet does it here on the second page. For you who are the one who woke the party of Muhammad in a jihad when they were heedless as if asleep. In other words, brackets, those Zengids didn't make it, did they? I would slightly contradict you. Yes, he had a rather anonymous early career, didn't do much. I think taking control of Egypt is pretty
No, that's an important thing, and he was good.
pretty good in its own right.
No, if you go back to Gibbs, and Gibbs makes it kind of a naive guy, he's, kind of fooled by some of his officers, he gets buffeted, but he has moral stature, that's the thing. Moral stature, great moral stature, calls him a mediocre tactician. He was a masterful politician, he's a political animal. He wouldn't have survived a day in Egypt if he hadn't been a political animal.
Yeah, but I think things like asking for a book of etiquette and how much money have I got here as soon as he arrived, within a year or so of getting power shows, and then immediately drawing around some of his entourage are from the Fatimid regime. Some of his secretariat are just like, I don't care who you worked for before, you're good, you're coming on my team now. And so I think, yeah, you're right, he's a politician. As a general, no, I don't think he's I wouldn't argue with that assessment at all.
Okay, now we have a couple of more questions, so I'm getting the students forward. Is that okay with you? Yeah.
Well, it's not really a question, it's more a fun story, and I feel like this room would enjoy it. Because you were talking about doing like live research. And for a class I was teaching a while ago, I was sort of interested in the fiction of the Crusades and popular media in the US today. And I went down this internet rabbit hole, I looked at Crusader memes and all the forums. It gets dark. But the funniest thing that I came across was a Crusader gun. It's like a big automatic rifle. I don't know anything about it. But what made it Crusader guns, you could switch between different modes. You had a mode that was war, and then another mode that was hyper, I assume. There was deals with the wood. And presumably the safety, and then you can see sort of kind of people, kind of geniuses that are to develop these guns. You had foxes. So they just looked at the dictionary and put in the genitive as well. I don't know, it's like super interesting.
I mean, the other element in the sense of looking at the modern memory of the Crusades is the far right, which of course, Breivik, his sort of endlessly tedious manifesto, the inscriptions on the guns of the Canterbury shooter and things like that, and the gun you're talking about. So in a sense of, sorry, I should have added that in the sense of the why we should do this kind of thing, the understanding, because I think that the intelligence agencies in the UK says there's a lot more stuff these days from the far right than there is from the Islamist side of things at the moment. That the volume of it is significantly greater. So particularly perhaps more so in Eastern Europe, but that embracing of the Crusader legacy, however simplistically, and then of course it seeps into Trump's America as well, is there.
Okay, we've got Anna and then Sini.
I was just curious, are there novels written about folk tales and how in different regions Southeast Asian incorporate these businesses? If you have meaning of celebration.
I can think of things like shadow plays, which are yet another sort of genre of things that are there. He doesn't feature in them massively, and apparently, strangely in Sicily, He's the baddie in the Shadow plays. Which again is rare for him to be sort of seen negatively in the West. He really is the bad guy. In terms of sort of broader kind of folk traditions down the centuries, I can't think of there's no Song of Saladin, I suppose, if you're thinking of things like that I'm aware of. Okay.
Go ahead.
So I thought you were going to say something that led.
There is a Song of Saladin. It's just 14th century primes.
Well, in the West, yeah.
But there is a land where he's winning tournaments, having the.
So I was thinking in the near, Saladin in the West in the 14th century is a whole different scene. Yeah. Sorry, I was thinking in the Near East. Yeah.
Eastern regional, folk section.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure they are there to be discovered.
So did you have a question?
I did have a question concerning the statue of Saladin, which made me think once again, what do you think the use of Saladin by modern dictators and wannabe authoritarian rulers, do you think that is he more, because I don't know, is he more like a unifier of the Islamic world, or is he unifier of Sunni? Because it's amazing how in the statue Saladin is shown as work with Sufi, and then as Herman, and then leader is Indian and Shakyon, I think. And I was wondering, even because isn't Assad family and Alawite Shia family? So it's interesting if they're using, because Assad was opening, he was unveiling in 1993 the statue. So it's interesting how. Is it possible somehow to push Shia demolition?
But I suppose he's there as the unifier.
Within the modern image, what do you think?
But in that instance, yeah, it's a specific political setting, and the button they are pushing there is Arab unity, and so that, in a sense, is what's overriding the kind of the screaming contradictions that you're pointing out, and so that's again is the emphasis that is being chosen there. But he is this kind of vehicle that can be deployed as wished, with a sort of choose the bits you want, ignore the bits you don't. But that's the emphasis clearly that they are putting, which kind of takes you back to the theatre.
And the movie is very much nationalism. Right?
Oh yeah.
Christians and Muslims being together, being Arab nationals together.
Yeah, totally. But that's Ireland, NASA's Egypt, 1961.
I think going just back to the two.
Yes.
Damascus. If you remember when we went to the tomb of Saladin, and we were also trying to look for the tomb of Nur ad-Din, and couldn't find it. And then eventually found the location, but it was inaccessible. It was in a madrasa. Yeah, but it was a very rundown area. There was no kind of easy direction to it. It wasn't a place that was. It clearly wasn't being sort of used or venerated in any kind of way. I think I'm right in remembering that they were also at that point renovating the tomb of Baybars. And of course the tomb of Saladin was right there and very visible. And it struck us that how kind of ironic it was in a way that Nur ad-Din is probably more kind of intimately associated with Damascus, as the ruler of Damascus is the builder of Palace of Justice and so on. And yet he was kind of almost simply forgotten compared to Saladin.
Yeah, he's the guy who did all the hard work.
Yeah.
But also when we were in that tomb, I remember we were also shocked. A young boy came in and started praying at Saladin's tomb. Osman was rather taken aback by that, and but that was interesting that there was like 20 of us in there, and this young boy just came in and started.
Right. So many thanks to Ruben and to Jonathan for wonderful presentations. Very interesting discussion. We're off to lunch. I'm sure you're all hungry. It's just the next door building. There's a restaurant there and there's a table ready for us. So everybody.
I'm going to ask you.
Oh, this- you can tell me all the things I got wrong. I did that. Is that a table of?
All kinds of jobs. I want to send you. Link to everyone identifying with.
Oh, yes, he does. He's, I'll pass that into the Cohen Gallipoli firm as well. I'll send that to you.
I'll see how.
Oh,
right.
Didn't I have? Translation.
Yeah.
Out there. So thank you. and-
Well, Carol wrote that book about Manticore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, that's quite an old
Yeah,
book.
but that-
Thank you for being so gentle.
Oh,
something that's
great.
one of
Where it is, I was gonna say where it was pride, but you can't say that today.
Well, first of all, today is the Pride Parade.
Yes, I know, that was the joke.
Yeah.
And my daughter was coming.
This one?
My daughter was going to the gay parade, in the Pride Parade.
Yeah.
Dale,
Yeah.
Raj is getting his MA. So he's at the Stokes.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, it's gonna be,
Yeah.
it's gonna be tennis. I
Yeah,
guess.
if I didn't have that, I would go too.
But, okay,
But no,
great to see you, Ruben. I really enjoyed your talk
Yeah,
as well.
good. So I owe you a article for the championship.
That's okay. Oh, yeah.
I will try by the end of July. Like that.
You. Yeah,
Okay.
I think got till about 10th of August is the, you know, in
Okay.
advance of.
It'll have to be done by the end of July, because I'm maybe going to Kazakhstan.
Oh,
First week of August.
awesome.
The Altea conference.
If you, some, yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
That would be great. And then that, I
How many
think,
votes do you want?
then, no. Should I send you, if I send you my chapter,
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
how the notes are done.
Well, I just finished, another came in.
Oh, cool.
I mean, I've seen the second book with me.
Yeah.
So I didn't start the interview, so I saw what, how they did in Brexit.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. And that then is volume 2 done.
Hmm?
That is volume 2 then,
Yeah.
done as well.
Two volumes?
64 chapters.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay, so good to see
okay,
you.
have a good fight back.
Yeah,
If
thank you.
If you were hanging around for another day or two, you're hanging around
Sorry?
for Saturday.
No, I have
you
to
could
leave
tomorrow.
very early.
What's the session and
Yeah,
then.
but if you're over in London, of course, just
Yeah,
drop me
well, I
a
may
call.
be in London, I'm gonna go to Belize.
I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Gary Chris organized.
Right, okay,
I'll be a day or two, so we'll see. Okay,
okay, all right.
if I finish, I'll let you. I finish the chapter, I'll let you, but I don't finish.
Yeah.
My name is Mud.
No, it's not, it's not. Okay, Ruben, thanks ever so much.
So you take away from there?
Okay. Hi, sorry, keep you waiting, Adam.
Oh, no worries. I was just interested in the, Saladin's book of etiquette and Domesday book.
Yeah,
I work with, 12th century, Kingdom of Jerusalem, expressions of kingship and exercise of royal authority, and Almeric's interest in Egypt is a very important part of that, and so I'm sort of interested in that. I suspect that Almeric had similar intentions. I believe he probably wanted Shawar in position as sort of the middleman, but I'm interested in what Saladin had done once he had taken over and sort of as a point of comparison in that Almeric did or was successful.
yeah, I mean, I think, the idea that I just think he's pretty well learned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which might then, in terms of then reviewing why they chose.
Yeah.
Well, we don't know much about it. It doesn't mean that his own office appreciate the was actually they're really good front man. Which they do. Look at the fact they don't rebel, they barely ever retaliate.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, of course, I could make an empire.